Tonight, we gather in this quiet space to receive what the Buddha has always offered freely: a way out of suffering, a path to peace, a method for transforming our relationship with life itself. You don't need to be Buddhist to receive this gift. You only need to be willing to listen. This is Buddha Bedtime Stories, where the ancient becomes immediate, where wisdom serves your present moment need for rest and clarity. Before we journey deeper, please tell me, what time is it where you are? And from what corner of the world are you listening? I'd love to know. The teachings we explore tonight aren't abstract concepts. They're practical wisdom about your mind, your emotions, your daily struggles. The Buddha wasn't interested in philosophy for its own sake. He wanted to end suffering, yours and everyone's. Let these stories seep into you like rain into dry earth. Don't try to hold on to them or figure them out. Just let them nourish something deep within that knows how to grow toward light. Now, settle yourself with intention. Your body deserves to be comfortable, supported, completely at ease. Make whatever adjustments call to you. Close your eyes and take a conscious breath, slow and full. As you exhale, imagine releasing this entire day. Breathe in again, this time welcoming peace, and let go completely. We're ready now. Let's begin with our first story. In a monastery, there was a meditation hall with a heavy wooden door that was always kept closed during practice sessions. The door had no lock, but everyone treated it as if it were locked, entering only at designated times and never leaving during meditation periods. A visiting monk named Gensho noticed this and asked why no one ever left during meditation, even though the door was clearly unlocked. It wouldn't be proper, one monk explained. During practice time, we stay in practice. Leaving would break the container, would disturb others, would show a lack of discipline. But you could leave if you wanted to, Gensho asked. Technically, yes, but we don't. Gensho found this fascinating. These monks were living as if imprisoned during meditation sessions, but the prison existed only in their minds. The door was open. They could leave any time, yet they sat as if bound. He began to notice similar patterns throughout the monastery. People living within invisible constraints, following rules that had no enforcement mechanism, restricting themselves to prisons that had no walls. One day, during a particularly long meditation session, Gensho stood up, walked to the door, opened it, stepped outside into the sunlight, and then walked back in and sat down. The other monks were shocked by this violation of protocol. Afterward, the abbot called Gensho to his chambers. "Why did you leave during meditation?" "To see if I could," Gensho replied, "to test whether the constraint was real or imagined." It was imagined. The door was never locked. I was never actually trapped. I was sitting there by choice, not by compulsion. "But we all know we could leave," the abbot said. "The point is that we choose not to." "Do you really know that?" Gensho asked. "Or have you assumed for so long that you shouldn't leave that you've forgotten you have a choice? There's a difference between staying by conscious choice and staying by habit or assumed constraint. One is freedom. The other is just a comfortable prison." This question disturbed many monks. They began to realize they had been treating many choices as if they were requirements. They had been living within restrictions that no one was actually enforcing. They had imprisoned themselves with beliefs about what they should or shouldn't do. The abbot considered Gensho's point carefully. "You're right," he admitted. "We've been treating the open door as if it were locked. We've been prisoners of our own assumptions. But what do we do with this awareness?" "First, acknowledge it," Gensho said. "See clearly that most of your constraints are chosen, not imposed. Then decide consciously, which constraints serve you? Which do you want to keep? And which are you maintaining out of habit or fear, not because they actually help you?" He gestured toward the meditation hall. "That door has always been open, but if you never test that, if you never actually check whether you could leave, then you're living as if imprisoned, even though you're free. True freedom begins with recognizing which prisons are real and which are imagined." Over the following weeks, the atmosphere in the monastery changed. Monks began questioning which rules actually served their practice and which they followed out of mere habit. They discovered they had internalized many restrictions that had no actual external enforcement. One monk realized he had been afraid to speak his honest opinions for years, not because speaking was forbidden, but because he had decided early on that it was safer to stay quiet. No one had actually silenced him. He had silenced himself. Another monk discovered he had been avoiding certain foods, not because of any monastic rule, but because he had once been told they were inappropriate for monks, and he had never questioned this. The restriction existed only in his belief. A third monk realized he had been limiting his meditation practice to certain times and places, not because practice was restricted to those times, but because he had created a mental rule about when and where meditation counted. "We've been living in prisons of our own making," one monk said during a group discussion. "The doors were open all along. We just never tried to walk through them." Gensho nodded. "Most people live this way. They believe they're trapped in circumstances, jobs, relationships, and patterns of behavior. They believe they have no choice. But often, if they examined closely, they'd discover the constraints are their own beliefs, not external reality. The door was never locked." The abbot asked, "But doesn't this lead to chaos? If everyone starts leaving meditation sessions whenever they want, ignoring the schedule, doing what they please, doesn't the structure fall apart?" "Possibly," Gensho agreed. "But structure maintained through unconscious compliance isn't real structure. It's just a habit pretending to be discipline. True structure comes from conscious choice. When people choose to stay, not because they believe they must, but because they genuinely want to, that's authentic practice. When they stay simply because they never questioned whether they could leave, that's just imprisonment with no walls." He looked around at the gathered monks. "I'm not suggesting you abandon all structure or discipline. I'm suggesting you own your choices. Recognize that you're staying because you choose to, not because you have to. Recognize that the door is open and you're free to leave, and then decide whether to stay or go based on authentic choice rather than assumed constraint." This teaching spread beyond the monastery. People in the nearby town heard about the open door and began examining their own lives. How many constraints were they living under that existed only in their minds? How many prisons had they created for themselves? A woman realized she had been staying in an unhappy marriage not because of any real obstacle to leaving, but because of stories she told herself about what leaving would mean. When she examined these stories, she found they were beliefs, not facts. The door had always been open. A man discovered he had been working at a job he hated for years, believing he had no choice, that his family responsibilities required it. When he looked honestly, he found there were other options he had never seriously considered because he had assumed from the beginning that he was trapped. An elderly person recognized that many of the limitations they experienced weren't from age or circumstance, but from beliefs about what old people could or couldn't do. The constraints were largely self-imposed. The teaching of the open door, people began to say, is that most prisons are mental. We're free more often than we realize. The question isn't whether we can leave, but whether we've been living as if we can't. Years later, the monastery still practiced meditation with a closed door during sessions. But now there was a different quality to it. Everyone knew the door was unlocked. Everyone knew they could leave any time they chose. They stayed not from obligation or assumed constraint, but from authentic choice. The practice deepened because people were choosing it freely, rather than submitting to it from habit or fear. Gensho's simple act of walking out and back in had freed an entire community from invisible prisons. Not by tearing down structure, but by revealing that structure maintained by genuine choice is stronger than structure maintained by unconscious compliance. Tonight, as you rest, you might examine the doors in your own life. Which ones do you believe are locked? Which constraints do you accept as unchangeable? What prisons are you living in that exist only in your beliefs? The door has always been open. You've always been freer than you realized. The constraints that feel so solid are often just habits of thought, beliefs you've never questioned, stories you've told yourself for so long that you mistake them for truth. You're not as trapped as you think. You have more choices than you've acknowledged. The prison is mostly mental, and mental prisons can be walked out of the moment you realize the door was never actually locked. This doesn't mean every choice is easy or without consequences, but it means you're choosing even when you believe you have no choice. And recognizing that you're choosing is the beginning of real freedom. Rest now in the understanding that you're freer than you knew. The door is open. It's always been open. You can stay or go based on authentic choice, not on assumed necessity. This recognition doesn't require you to change anything external. It just requires you to see clearly. The constraints you live under are more permeable than you thought. You've had more freedom all along. You just haven't been exercising it. Sleep now as a free person, aware that tomorrow you can walk through any open door you choose, or stay where you are by genuine choice, rather than imagined imprisonment. The freedom was always yours. Now you know it. In a valley between two mountain ranges, there was a river that confused everyone who saw it. Most rivers in the region flowed from high elevations to low, following gravity as rivers should. But this river appeared to run uphill, flowing from what looked like lower ground to higher ground, defying logic and nature. Villagers argued about the river for generations. Some said it was cursed, that supernatural forces made it run backwards. Others insisted it was an optical illusion, that the river only appeared to run uphill but actually didn't. A few claimed the river was evidence of magic in the world, proof that natural laws could be suspended. A scholar named Fumiko came to study the peculiar river. She was a woman who trusted observation over superstition, who believed that understanding came from careful study rather than easy assumptions. She spent weeks walking the river's length, taking measurements, making careful notes. What she discovered was unexpected. The river wasn't running uphill at all, though it certainly appeared to be. The optical illusion was created by the unusual topology of the valley. The way surrounding hills created a visual context that made lower ground appear higher and higher ground appear lower. When you adjusted for this visual distortion and looked at actual elevations, the river was flowing downhill as it should, following gravity perfectly. But there was a second discovery, more interesting than the first. There was a short section where the river actually did flow uphill, pushed by an underground spring with such force that it created a brief reversal of normal flow before gravity took over again. This wasn't magic or curse, it was hydrology, underground pressure overcoming gravity temporarily, a natural phenomenon that looked miraculous only because people didn't understand the forces involved. Fumiko shared her findings with the villagers, explaining the optical illusion and the underground spring. Some villagers were relieved to have the mystery explained. Others were disappointed. They had preferred the magical explanation to the scientific one. But an old farmer named Gonji said something that made Fumiko reconsider what she thought she'd discovered. "The river teaches something important," Gonji said. "It teaches that things can look completely wrong while being completely right, that what appears to violate natural laws might just be responding to forces we don't understand yet." He pointed to his fields. "I plant crops that other farmers say won't grow in this soil. They say I'm working against nature, that I should plant what everyone plants. But I've learned that this soil has properties they don't understand, that what looks like wrong farming is actually right farming for these specific conditions." Fumiko thought about this. She had explained the river's apparent backwards flow, but Gonji was suggesting something deeper, that the river taught people to question their assumptions about what's natural, what's possible, what's right. The river looked wrong, but was responding perfectly to actual conditions, both the optical conditions that made flow appear backwards, and the geological conditions that briefly pushed water uphill. "You're saying the river teaches us to look deeper before judging?" Fumiko asked. "More than that," Gonji replied. "It teaches us that backwards and forwards depend on what forces you're aware of. To someone who only knows gravity, water flowing uphill is impossible, wrong, against nature. But to someone who understands underground pressure, water flowing uphill is perfectly natural, a correct response to present forces." He gestured to the river. "How many things in life look wrong because we're only seeing some of the forces involved? How many people are judged for going against the flow when they're actually responding to forces others can't see?" Over the following months, Fumiko expanded her study. She began collecting stories of things that appeared to violate natural expectations, but actually didn't. They just responded to forces that weren't immediately obvious. A tree growing bent at a strange angle because of prevailing winds that had since died down. A flower blooming in winter because of an underground hot spring. A bird flying inland before storms because it sensed pressure changes humans couldn't detect. Each example taught the same lesson. What appears wrong might be responding perfectly to reality, while what appears right might be ignorant of important forces. A young mother came to Fumiko with a problem. My son won't follow the path I've set for him. He's going backwards from where he should go, against everything natural and right. How do I make him flow the right direction? Tell me about your son, Fumiko said. The mother described a boy who refused to take over the family business, who wanted instead to become a traveling musician. It's backwards, she insisted. Children should continue family work. That's the natural flow. He's going against nature. Or he's responding to forces you're not seeing, Fumiko suggested gently. Is he talented musically? Very, but that's not the point. Talent doesn't change duty. Doesn't it? Fumiko asked. The river appears to flow backwards because of forces beneath the surface. Perhaps your son is flowing in a direction that looks backwards to you, but is actually responding to forces inside him, talents, passions, purposes that you can't see or don't value. Just because his flow doesn't match your expectations doesn't mean it's wrong. She told the mother about the river, about how it appeared to defy nature, but actually followed it perfectly when all forces were considered. Your son might be like that river. What looks like backwards rebellion might be forward movement towards something he's meant to do. The question isn't whether he's flowing the way you expected, but whether he's flowing true to himself. This conversation troubled the mother, but she began to observe her son differently. She noticed how music seemed to flow from him naturally, how he came alive when playing, how his path, though different from hers, had its own rightness to it. Eventually, though it was difficult, she accepted that his backwards path might be his right path. Word spread about Fumiko's teachings about the backwards river. People began using it as a way to reconsider their own judgments. When someone's path looked wrong, they would ask, "Am I seeing all the forces involved? Or am I judging based on incomplete understanding?" A magistrate applied this thinking to a legal case. A man had broken a law, but when the magistrate investigated deeper, he found forces that explained the law-breaking in a way that changed the judgment entirely. The man wasn't defying order. He was responding to a greater order that the law itself hadn't anticipated. A teacher applied it to a student who learned differently from others. Instead of judging the student as backwards or wrong, the teacher looked for the forces, the different cognitive patterns, the unique intelligences that made the student's apparently backwards approach actually forward for him. Years later, Fumiko's study of the backwards river had become famous beyond the valley. She was invited to give lectures, to advise rulers, to teach scholars. But she always returned to the river itself, watching its apparently impossible flow, using it to remind herself that understanding requires humility, that what appears wrong might be right in ways she hasn't yet grasped. A visiting philosopher asked her, "But aren't some things actually wrong? Doesn't your river teaching lead to excusing everything, to saying nothing is really backwards because we just don't understand the forces?" "No," Fumiko replied carefully. "Some things are genuinely wrong. They're responding to destructive forces like cruelty or ignorance or selfishness. The river teaches discernment, not relativism. It teaches us to look for forces we might not see before judging, but after looking, we still make judgments. The difference is, Our judgments are informed by deeper understanding rather than surface appearance. She pointed to the river. This river looks backwards, but isn't. But if a farmer tried to make his irrigation flow uphill without underground spring pressure, that would be genuinely backwards, genuinely wrong. The teaching isn't that everything is right. The teaching is that apparent wrongness requires investigation before judgment. Some backwards flows are responding to forces we need to understand. Others are just backwards. Tonight, as you rest, you might reconsider things in your life that appear backwards or wrong. Your own path that doesn't match expectations. Other people's choices that confuse you. Circumstances that seem to violate how things should be. Before judging these as wrong, ask, what forces might I not be seeing? What underground pressures might be pushing flow in directions that look impossible, but are actually perfectly natural? The backwards river teaches humility in judgment, curiosity before conclusion, openness to forces you don't yet understand. Not everything that looks wrong is right, but some things that look wrong are responding to reality more accurately than things that look right. The only way to know is to look deeper, to consider forces beyond the obvious, to remain humble about the limits of your understanding. Rest now in acceptance of apparent backwards flows in yourself and others. Let the river run its course, responding to all the forces acting on it, both visible and hidden. Trust that what looks impossible might be possible, that what seems backwards might be forward, that nature is wiser than our quick judgments about what's natural. The river knows where it's going, even when it appears to go the wrong way. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us turn to a tale about recognition and the true nature of worth. This is the next story. In a bustling market town, there were two merchants who sold rice side by side. One was named Kenji, the other Taro. Both had successful businesses. Both were known throughout the region. But their approaches to business could not have been more different. Kenji used scales that he had carefully adjusted to weigh slightly in his favor. Not much, just enough that most customers wouldn't notice. Over the course of a year, this small deception added significantly to his profits. He told himself everyone did it, that it was just smart business, that customers expected to be cheated a little and factored it into their calculations. Taro, on the other hand, used scales that were calibrated perfectly. He would even add a bit extra to each purchase, telling customers, better to give too much than too little. His profits were smaller than Kenji's, but his conscience was clear. Kenji would mock Taro privately. "You're a fool," he would say. "You could be making so much more. The customers don't know the difference. Why cheat yourself?" "I'm not cheating myself," Taro would reply. "I'm paying myself in peace of mind. Every transaction I make, I know I've been honest. That's worth more to me than extra profit." "Peace of mind doesn't feed your family," Kenji scoffed. "Money feeds your family." For years this continued. Kenji's business appeared more successful. He had a larger house, finer clothes, and more luxuries. Taro lived modestly, comfortable, but not wealthy. To outside observers, Kenji's approach seemed vindicated. Then one day, a wealthy lord came to the market to purchase rice for his household. He was known for being meticulous and for testing merchants' honesty. He had brought his own perfectly calibrated scales. He went first to Kenji's stall and purchased a measure of rice. Then he weighed it on his own scales. the shortage was immediately apparent. "Your scales are dishonest," the Lord said coldly. Kenji's face went white. "My lord, there must be some mistake." "Perhaps your scales are inaccurate." "My scales are tested regularly by the Imperial Standards Office," the Lord replied. "Yours are deliberately fraudulent. Not only will I not purchase from you, but I will ensure that everyone in my household and in my social circle knows of your dishonesty." The Lord then went to Taro's stall and made the same purchase. When he weighed it on his own scales, he found that Taro had actually given more than the agreed upon amount. "Your scales are generous," the Lord said with approval. "I prefer to err on the side of giving too much," Taro replied simply. "Then you have earned my business and my recommendation," the Lord said. "From now on, all the rice for my household will be purchased from you, and I will tell others of your integrity." Within weeks, Taro's business had doubled, then tripled. The Lord's recommendation brought customers from the wealthiest families in the region. Meanwhile, Kenji's business collapsed. Once word spread about his dishonest scales, even his regular customers stopped coming. His reputation destroyed, he eventually had to close his stall. Years later, Kenji came to Taro humbled and seeking work. "I was wrong," he admitted. "I thought honesty was expensive, but dishonesty cost me everything." Taro hired him, but on one condition, that Kenji help maintain the scales, calibrating them regularly to ensure perfect accuracy. "You need to rebuild your relationship with honesty," Taro said. "Start here, with these scales. Every time you calibrate them, remember that integrity isn't about what others can see. It's about what you know about yourself." As Kenji worked with the honest scales day after day, something shifted in him. He had spent so many years cheating in small ways that he had forgotten what it felt like to be completely honest. The dishonesty had eaten at him in ways he hadn't even recognized, creating a constant low-level anxiety about being discovered, a subtle shame he carried everywhere. Now, working with honest scales, treating every customer fairly, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Simple peace. No anxiety about being caught. No shame about his methods. No exhausting mental calculations about how much he could get away with. One day, a customer accidentally gave him too much money. The old Kenji would have pocketed it without comment. But now, without even thinking, he called the customer back and returned the extra coins. "You've changed," Taro observed, watching this exchange. "I'm remembering who I was before I started cheating," Kenji replied. "I forgot that honesty feels good, that it's actually easier than dishonesty because you don't have to remember your lies or worry about being discovered. I thought I was taking a shortcut to success, but I was actually taking a shortcut to misery." He looked at the scales, perfectly balanced. "These scales are the most honest thing in this market. They don't calculate or scheme or try to get away with anything. They just measure truly. I spent years being more clever than these scales and less wise." Taro nodded. The scales teach a simple lesson. Integrity is its own reward. Not because good things always happen to honest people, but because living with integrity creates internal peace that no amount of profit gained through dishonesty can match. You sleep better. You walk lighter. You meet people's eyes without flinching. These things have value that can't be measured in coins. A young merchant who was just starting came to Taro for advice. Everyone says I should adjust my scales just a little, that it's how business is done. But it feels wrong. What should I do? Taro had Kenji answer. I spent 20 years cheating, Kenji said, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to restore the character I damaged in myself. The extra profit wasn't worth it, not even close. Your scales are a mirror of your character. Keep them honest, and you keep yourself honest. Cheat them, and you cheat yourself in ways that matter far more than money. The young merchant looked at Kenji with curiosity. But didn't you make more money by cheating? For a while, Kenji admitted. But I lost it all when my dishonesty was discovered. More importantly, I lost something that took much longer to rebuild. My ability to respect myself. Every time I looked in a mirror, I saw a cheat. Every time I counted my profits, I knew they were partly stolen. Every interaction with customers involved acting, pretending, and hiding what I really was. It was exhausting and corrosive. He gestured to the perfectly balanced scales. These scales are at peace. They have nothing to hide, nothing to defend, nothing to remember or cover up. They just are what they are. That's what integrity gives you. The peace of being what you are without pretense or deception. It's the most valuable thing I've learned, and I learned it the hard way. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider your own scales. Where in your life are you adjusting the balance, even slightly in your own favor? Where are you being less than completely honest, with others or with yourself? These small dishonesties might seem insignificant, but they accumulate. They create a background noise of anxiety and shame that you carry everywhere. What would it feel like to calibrate your scales perfectly? To be completely honest, even when no one is watching, even when you could get away with a small deception. Not because of fear of being caught, but because integrity itself is the reward. Because living with honest scales creates an internal peace that no amount of clever advantage taking can provide. Rest tonight in honesty. Let go of all the small ways you've been adjusting the scales. Let go of the exhausting mental work of maintaining deceptions. Be like the perfectly balanced scale, true, honest, at peace with what you are. The reward isn't somewhere in the future. The reward is the immediate relief of no longer having to hide, to calculate, to worry about being discovered. Honest scales don't lie awake at night. Neither do honest hearts. In a village known for pottery, there lived a potter named Masao who had studied for decades under the greatest masters. He created bowls, cups, and vessels of exceptional quality, each piece perfectly formed, perfectly glazed, perfectly fired. His work was sought after by tea masters and collectors, and he took enormous pride in never releasing a flawed piece. Any pot that emerged from the kiln with even the slightest imperfection, Masao would destroy immediately. A hairline crack, an uneven glaze, a slight asymmetry, these were intolerable failures in his eyes. His studio floor was littered with shards of pieces that hadn't met his exacting standards. One day, Masao created a tea bowl for the most important commission of his life. The provincial governor had requested a ceremonial bowl for an upcoming tea gathering with the emperor. Masao worked on this bowl for weeks, preparing the clay with unusual care, forming it with absolute precision, applying the glaze with perfect evenness. When he opened the kiln after firing, his heart sank. The bowl was magnificent in form, perfect in proportion, beautiful in color. But there, running from the rim down the side, was a crack. Not a dramatic break, but a fine line that compromised the bowl's perfection. Masao's first instinct was to smash it immediately, as he did with all flawed work. But the deadline was close, and he had no time to create another bowl of this quality. He sat staring at the cracked bowl, torn between his standards and his practical needs. Finally, he decided to show it to the governor and explain the situation, offering to work day and night to create a replacement. When he presented the bowl and apologized for its flaw, the governor examined it carefully. "This crack," the governor said, tracing it with his finger. "It's interesting. It adds something to the piece. It makes it unique." "It makes it flawed," Masao protested. "A tea bowl should be perfect. This crack means the bowl could fail, could break apart entirely. It's a structural weakness." "Or it's a story," the governor replied. "This bowl is telling us something, that even in our most careful efforts, nature has its own say. The fire does what it will. The clay responds according to its own nature. Your perfect technique met forces beyond your control, and this crack is the conversation between them." He held the bowl up to the light. "I think I'll use this bowl for the emperor's tea." A perfect bowl says nothing except, "Look how skilled the potter is." This bowl says something more interesting. "Look how skill and accident can create something neither could create alone." Masao was unconvinced but had no choice. The governor kept the cracked bowl. On the day of the emperor's visit, Masao attended the tea ceremony, anxious about his flawed work being used in such an important context. The emperor held the bowl, examining it from every angle. He paused at the crack, running his thumb along it thoughtfully. Masao held his breath, certain his reputation was about to be destroyed. "This crack," the emperor said finally, "is the most honest thing in this entire ceremony. Everything else is pretending to be perfect. The precise movements, the practiced words, the carefully arranged flowers. But this bowl admits it's not perfect. It shows its vulnerability. And in doing so, it invites us to be real rather than ceremonial." He looked directly at Masao. "Did you make this crack deliberately?" "No, Your Majesty," Masao admitted. "It's a flaw. I almost destroyed the bowl because of it." "Then it's a gift," the emperor replied. "A deliberate crack would be pretentious, a manufactured authenticity. But this crack happened. The bowl is showing us the truth of its making, that fire and clay have their own will, that perfection is an illusion, that beauty can include what we consider flaws." After the ceremony, a renowned tea master approached Masao. "That bowl is the finest piece you've ever created." "But it's cracked," Masao said, still unable to accept this interpretation. "Exactly," the tea master replied. "Your perfect bowls are impressive but distant. They're so perfect they feel inhuman, unreal. But this bowl with its crack is approachable. It's marked by the actual process of its creation. It doesn't pretend to be more than what it is, clay and glaze and fire meeting imperfectly." He held the bowl carefully. "In the tea ceremony, we value wabi-sabi, the beauty of imperfection, impermanence, and incompleteness. Your perfect bowls violate wabi-sabi. They're trying too hard to be permanent, complete, perfect. This cracked bowl embodies wabi-sabi perfectly. It shows age before it's even been used. It admits its fragility. It's honest. Over the following weeks, Masao struggled with this new perspective. His entire career had been built on the pursuit of perfection, on the elimination of flaws. Now he was being told that his flawed bowl was his finest work precisely because of its flaw. He began to experiment. He still created bowls with his full skill and attention, but he stopped destroying pieces that emerged with cracks, asymmetries, or irregularities. He studied these flawed pieces, trying to understand what made some flaws interesting and others merely defects. He discovered something subtle. There were flaws that came from carelessness or poor technique, and these did diminish the work. But some flaws came from the honest interaction of materials and fire, and these often added something that perfect technique alone could never achieve. The cracked bowl became famous. Tea masters throughout the region requested pieces from Masao that had this quality of honest imperfection. He became known not for perfect bowls, but for bowls that told the truth of their making, that showed the conversation between intention and accident, control and surrender. "I spent 30 years trying to eliminate every flaw," Masao would tell students who came to learn from him. "I thought my job was to impose my will perfectly on clay and fire. But actually, my job is to create conditions and then allow the fire to have its say. The crack in that bowl taught me that some of what I called flaws were actually the fire's contribution to the work. I was rejecting collaboration, insisting on control. The crack showed me a better way." He would show students two bowls, one perfect by traditional standards, one marked by a crack or asymmetry. Which is more beautiful? The answer depends on what you value. If you value technical mastery and perfect execution, choose the perfect bowl. If you value honesty and the authentic marks of process, choose the cracked one. Neither is wrong, but I wasted decades making only one kind of bowl because I couldn't see value in the other. A young potter asked, "So should we try to make flawed pieces? Should we create cracks deliberately?" "No," Masao replied firmly. "Deliberate cracks are dishonest, just a performance of imperfection. Do your best work, use your full skill and attention, then accept what emerges, including the flaws. Some flaws you'll need to recognize as failures, results of inattention or poor technique that you can learn from. But some flaws you'll need to recognize as gifts, contributions from forces beyond your control that add something you couldn't have planned." He held up the famous cracked bowl, now aged and stained from years of use. "This bowl has served the emperor and countless tea masters. The crack never caused it to fail. Instead, the crack gave it character, made it memorable, and allowed it to teach something that perfect bowls never could. What I considered its fatal flaw was actually its finest feature." Tonight, as you rest, you might reconsider your own cracks, your own flaws, the things about yourself or your life that don't meet your standards of perfection. What if some of these aren't failures but features? What if what you consider your greatest weakness is actually adding something that strength alone never could? The cracked bowl served perfectly. Its flaw didn't prevent it from holding tea. It enhanced its ability to hold meaning. Your flaws might work the same way. They might not prevent you from serving your purpose. They might deepen it, make it more honest, more relatable, more real. Rest now in acceptance of your cracks. Not every imperfection is a gift, but some are. Not every flaw adds value, but some do. The question isn't whether you're perfect. You're not, and you never will be. The question is whether your imperfections are honest marks of your making, authentic results of your interaction with forces beyond your control. Those kinds of flaws don't diminish you. They complete you. The potter's cracked bowl teaches that perfection isn't always the goal. Sometimes the goal is authenticity, honesty, and the willingness to show the truth of your process, including its imperfections. Sleep now as a cracked bowl, flawed but functional, imperfect but honest, broken in ways that somehow make you more whole. As we move deeper into the quiet teachings of Zen, we come to a story about seeing clearly and understanding true value. Listen carefully to the next story. There was a young man named Koji whose father had died, leaving substantial debts. The creditors came to Koji expecting him to assume responsibility for his father's obligations. Koji, believing this was his duty as the son, worked himself nearly to death trying to repay the money his father had borrowed. For 3 years, Koji labored from dawn to dusk. He took multiple jobs, spent almost nothing on himself, and sent every coin he earned to his father's creditors. His health suffered. His youth was consumed by obligation. He became bitter and resentful, angry at his father for leaving him this burden. A traveling monk named Bankei came to the town and noticed Koji's exhaustion. He asked the young man why he looked so worn. "I'm repaying my father's debts," Koji explained. "He died owing money, and as his son, the responsibility falls to me." "Did you borrow this money?" Bankei asked. "No, my father did." "Did you receive any benefit from what the money purchased?" "No, he borrowed it for his gambling and drinking." "Then why are you repaying it?" Koji looked at the monk in confusion. "Because I'm his son. Because the creditors say I must. Because it's my duty." Bankei shook his head gently. "You can choose to repay debts that aren't yours. That's your choice, but understand that you're choosing it, not that you must do it. Your father's choices were his own. His debts were his own. They died with him. The creditors may pressure you, society may tell you it's your obligation, but actually you're free. You've been carrying a burden that was never yours to carry." Koji felt anger rise in him. "So I should just abandon my father's debts? That would dishonor his memory." "Is working yourself to death to pay for his gambling honoring his memory?" Bankei asked quietly. "Or is it perpetuating the harm he caused? Your father made choices that hurt himself and others. You don't honor him by destroying yourself for those choices. You honor him by living differently, by not continuing the cycle of harm." This conversation shook something loose in Koji. He had never questioned the assumption that his father's debts were now his. Everyone had told him this was his duty, and he had accepted it without examination. He began asking questions. Legally, were his father's debts actually his responsibility? He discovered they were not. The creditors had relied on his sense of filial duty and his ignorance of his legal rights. He had been free all along, but hadn't known it. Koji stopped making payments on his father's debts. The creditors threatened and complained, but they had no legal claim on him. He used his labor now to build his own life, to recover his health, to create a future not defined by his father's mistakes. Some people in the village criticized him. "He abandoned his father's debts," they whispered. "He has no filial piety." But Bankei, before leaving town, gave Koji final words of wisdom. Carrying debts that aren't yours doesn't make you virtuous. It makes you a volunteer victim. Your father's poor choices created consequences. Those consequences were his to face, not yours to inherit. You can feel compassion for him without taking on burdens that aren't yours. You can love someone without destroying yourself for their mistakes. Years later, when Koji had built a successful life and even helped others in his community who were struggling, someone asked him, "Don't you feel guilty for not repaying your father's debts?" "No," Koji replied. "I felt guilty for years while I was killing myself trying to repay them. But the guilt was about other people's expectations, not about actual obligation. My father's debts were his own. His choices were his own. I honor his memory better by living well and helping others than I would by destroying myself for mistakes I didn't make." Tonight, what debts are you carrying that were never yours? What burdens did you inherit from parents, from past relationships, from circumstances beyond your control? What shame or obligation have you assumed just because someone told you that you must? You're allowed to put these down. You're allowed to say, "This was never mine to carry." The debts of others, the mistakes of the past, the expectations of people who had no right to place them on you. None of these are truly yours, unless you choose to make them so. Rest tonight in freedom from all inherited burdens. You're responsible for your own choices, not for everyone else's. Let the dead bury the dead. Let old debts stay where they belong. You're free. In a garden temple, the monks kept a beautiful crane named Haku in a large bamboo enclosure. Haku had been brought to the temple as an injured chick, nursed back to health, and raised in the enclosure where he was safe from predators and provided with ample food. For 3 years, Haku lived comfortably in his bamboo home. The monks fed him daily, cleaned his space, and even spoke to him in gentle tones. He had everything a crane could need except freedom, though the monks assured themselves they were keeping him safe. One day, a traveling priest named Osho visited the temple and saw Haku in his enclosure. The priest noticed that Haku's wings had grown strong and full. He was clearly capable of flight, yet he never attempted to fly beyond the bamboo walls, even though portions of the enclosure were open to the sky. "Why doesn't your crane fly away?" Osho asked the monks. "He could if he wanted to," one monk replied. "We don't clip his wings." "But he stays because he knows this is where his food comes, where he's safe, where he belongs." Osho watched Haku for several days. The crane would walk around his enclosure, occasionally stretching his wings, but never attempting actual flight. It was as if Haku had forgotten that flight was even possible, that his wings had any purpose beyond stretching. On his last day at the temple, Osho asked permission to enter Haku's enclosure. He approached the crane slowly, then suddenly clapped his hands and shouted, startling Haku into the air. The crane's wings opened instinctively, and for a moment, Haku was flying, truly flying, circling above the enclosure in surprise. But after only 2 circles, Haku landed back in his familiar corner, as if the brief flight had frightened rather than thrilled him. He settled back into his routine immediately, walking the same worn paths he always walked. The monks were angry. "You scared him! You could have hurt him." "I showed him he could fly," Osho replied calmly, "but he chose to land." That choice tells me something important. Your crane is imprisoned not by bamboo walls, but by comfort. He could leave any time, but he won't, because the enclosure has become more familiar than freedom. He looked at the monks gathered around him. And before you judge Haku too harshly, ask yourselves, how are you different? How many of you are living in comfortable enclosures of your own making, never attempting to fly because the familiar is safer than the possible? One young monk, named Botan, was particularly struck by this question. He realized he had been at the temple for 5 years, had taken preliminary vows, but had never fully committed to the monastic life. He was comfortable in this in-between state, receiving the structure and security of monastery life without the full commitment it demanded. Like Haku, he had wings he never used. After Osho left, Botan couldn't stop thinking about the crane. He began to see Haku differently, not as a bird being kept safe, but as a bird being kept comfortable in a cage he could leave any time. And he began to see himself the same way. He started paying attention to all the ways the monastery had become his comfortable enclosure. He knew when every meal would come. He knew exactly what each day would bring. He had routines that felt safe, relationships that felt predictable, a life that felt controlled. And he realized this comfort was preventing him from attempting the flight that monastic life was actually meant to enable. The leap into full commitment, into genuine spiritual practice, into the risk and uncertainty that real transformation requires. "I've been living like Haku," Botan confessed to the abbot. "Safe and comfortable, but not really alive. Not really practicing, just walking the same familiar paths day after day." The abbot, who'd been troubled by Osho's words about the crane, nodded. "You're not alone." Many of us have made the monastery into a comfortable cage rather than a launching place. We've mistaken security for wisdom, routine for practice, comfort for peace. He gestured toward Haku's enclosure. The priest was right to startle the crane into flight. Not to frighten him, but to remind him what his wings were for. Perhaps we all need to be startled sometimes, reminded that we have wings we're not using, capabilities we're not exercising, flights we're not attempting, because the ground feels safer. The monks began to look at their own lives with new eyes. They noticed patterns of comfortable avoidance, ways they stayed safely within self-imposed limits, flights they could attempt but didn't. The monastery, meant to be a place of transformation, had become for many a place of comfortable stagnation. Gradually, changes began to happen. Monks who had been avoiding difficult practices began to attempt them. Commitments that had been postponed were made. Risks that had seemed too frightening were taken. Not everyone changed. Some preferred the comfortable enclosure, but many discovered they had wings they had forgotten about. As for Haku, the monks began to encourage him to fly, taking him to open areas and gently startling him into the air. At first, he would fly only briefly before landing back in familiar territory, but eventually, his flights grew longer. One day, Haku flew beyond the temple grounds entirely and didn't return. The monks felt both loss and joy. They had loved having Haku, but they recognized that keeping him comfortable had been keeping him caged. Setting him free, truly free, not just free within limits, was the compassionate thing, even though it meant losing him. Botan, watching Haku disappear into the distance, felt inspired. If a crane can remember how to fly after 3 years of comfortable captivity, then surely I can remember what I came here to do. I've been in my bamboo enclosure long enough. He took his final vows that week, fully committing to monastic life. It was terrifying in a way his comfortable half-commitment had never been. But it was also exhilarating, like stretching wings he had forgotten he possessed. Years later, when Botan had become a teacher, he would often tell the story of Haku the crane. "We all build comfortable enclosures," he would say. "Relationships that feel safe but limit growth. Jobs that provide security but prevent exploration. Routines that feel comforting but cage us. The bamboo walls look like protection, but they're actually prevention, preventing us from discovering what we're capable of, from attempting flights we were made for." Students would ask, but how do we know when comfort has become a cage? When should we leave the enclosure? When you're walking the same paths day after day without growth, Botan would reply. When you've stopped even looking at the sky. When you've forgotten you have wings. When the thought of flying fills you with fear rather than excitement. These are signs that comfort has become captivity, that the safe enclosure has become a prison you don't recognize as a prison because it's comfortable. He would pause, then add, "The tragedy isn't being in the enclosure. The tragedy is forgetting you can leave, forgetting you were made for flight, forgetting that your wings have purpose beyond stretching." Haku lived 3 years in comfortable captivity before someone reminded him he could fly. How many years will you live in yours before you remember? Tonight, as you rest, you might consider your own bamboo enclosure. What comfortable cage have you built for yourself? What safe patterns have you established that prevent growth? What flights are you not attempting because staying grounded feels safer? You have wings. You've always had wings. The question isn't whether you're capable of flight. You are. The question is whether you've become so comfortable with the ground that you've forgotten that the sky is where you belong. Whether the bamboo enclosure feels so safe that you've stopped noticing it's still an enclosure. Rest tonight with this awareness. Tomorrow, you could fly. You could attempt something that terrifies you. You could leave the comfortable patterns and risk the unknown. You could stretch your wings, not just as exercise, but as preparation for actual flight. The cage isn't locked. It never was. You've just been comfortable enough that you forgot to try the door. Sleep now and dream of flying. Let some part of you remember what your wings are for. And when you wake, maybe, just maybe, you'll be ready to find out what happens when you actually use them. With each step on the Zen path, a new lesson unfolds. Now we turn to a story about recognition, of self, of others, and of what truly matters. Listen carefully to the next story. In a forest where many birds lived, there was one small brown bird that behaved strangely. While all the other birds worked hard building nests, gathering twigs and moss and feathers, creating elaborate homes in preparation for different seasons, this bird built nothing. She would sleep one night in the hollow of a tree, the next night in thick bushes, the next night on a sheltered branch. The other birds gossiped about her. She's lazy, some said. She's foolish, others claimed. Winter will come, or the rainy season, and she'll have no shelter. She'll regret her lack of planning. The brown bird heard these comments but continued her way of living. Each evening, she would look for where to sleep, finding whatever natural shelter was available. Each morning, she would wake, eat, sing, and fly, unburdened by the need to return to any particular place. One spring, a terrible storm came through the forest. The wind howled for 3 days, trees bent and branches broke. Many carefully built nests were destroyed, torn apart by wind or crushed by falling limbs. Birds who had spent weeks constructing elaborate homes watched them disintegrate in hours. After the storm, the forest was full of distressed birds, mourning their lost nests, wondering how they would rebuild, and feeling that their security had been destroyed. But the brown bird was untroubled. The hollow tree where she had slept the night before the storm was now filled with water, so she simply found a dry hollow in a different tree. The bushes she had used the previous week were flattened, so she used different bushes. Her lack of attachment to any particular shelter meant she had lost nothing in the storm. A wise old owl, who had also lost his nest to the storm, noticed this. He approached the brown bird one morning. "I've watched you for years," the owl said, "and I always thought you were improvident, failing to plan for the future. But now I see something different. You have a kind of security that those of us with nests don't have." "What do you mean?" the bird asked. "Our security depends on things," the owl explained. "On nests, on accumulated materials, on particular places. When those things are destroyed, we feel our security is destroyed. But your security doesn't depend on anything or any place. It depends on your ability to find shelter wherever you are. That can't be destroyed by a storm." The bird tilted her head thoughtfully. "I never thought about it that way. I just go where the shelter is. If one place doesn't work, I find another place. It seems simple." "It is simple," the owl agreed. "But it requires something that's actually quite difficult, letting go of attachment to any particular place or thing. Most of us can't do that. We want the security of returning to the same nest, the same tree, the same familiar place. We want to own a piece of the forest. You're content to belong to the whole forest without owning any of it." Over the following weeks, as birds worked to rebuild their nests, some began to notice what the owl had noticed. The brown bird was never without shelter, never anxious about losing her home, never burdened by protecting what she had accumulated. She had a lightness that the nest-building birds lacked. A young bird who was exhausted from gathering materials for her third attempt at building a nest that kept falling apart asked the brown bird, "Don't you ever want a nest of your own? A place that's yours, that you can return to?" "I have the whole forest," the brown bird replied. "Every hollow tree, every sheltered branch, every thick bush, all of it is available to me. If I claimed one spot as mine, I would have less, not more. I would have one nest instead of countless possibilities." "But what about security?" the young bird persisted. "What about having something solid and permanent?" The brown bird looked at the young bird's partially built nest, already showing signs of the same structural problems that had doomed the previous 2 attempts. "Is your nest permanent? The storm showed us that nothing we build lasts forever. Everything changes. The tree that's perfect today might fall tomorrow. The branch that seems strong might break. If your security depends on things staying the same, You'll always be afraid. She ruffled her feathers and continued. My security comes from knowing I can adapt. I can find shelter in many places. I can adjust to changing conditions. I don't need things to stay the same to be okay. That's a kind of security that storms can't destroy. A monk who lived near the forest and fed the birds sometimes would observe them. He heard other humans talk about the brown bird, calling her the foolish one who didn't plan. But he saw something different. That bird understands Wu Wei, he told visitors. She flows with circumstances instead of trying to control them. She works with what is instead of clinging to what was. The other birds work very hard to create security, but their security is brittle because it depends on things staying the same. Her security is flexible because it depends on her ability to work with change. He would point to human lives too. We're like the nest-building birds. We accumulate possessions, thinking they'll make us secure. We cling to jobs, relationships, identities, thinking that if we can just keep things from changing, we'll be safe. But everything changes. The storm always comes eventually. And when it does, all that accumulated security can vanish in a day. People would ask him, so should we not plan? Not build, not try to create stability. Build if you want to build, he would reply. Plan if you want to plan. But hold it all lightly. Don't let your security depend on things remaining unchanged. Develop the brown bird skill, the ability to find shelter in new circumstances, to adapt to change, to let go of what's gone and work with what's here. That's real security, not having a nest, having the ability to live without one. Some listeners understood this teaching. They began to hold their possessions more lightly, to see their homes as temporary shelters rather than permanent fortresses, to develop skills and relationships and inner resources that could adapt to changing circumstances rather than relying on things staying the same. Others couldn't hear it. They kept building bigger nests, acquiring more stuff, trying to make themselves so secure that change couldn't touch them. And then they would suffer greatly when the inevitable storms came. The brown bird lived many years in her nestless way. When she finally died, peacefully in a hollow log during a quiet night, the forest birds gathered to remember her. Even the birds who had once mocked her improvidence now spoke of her with respect. She taught us something important, the old owl said. That true security doesn't come from having much, but from needing little. Not from keeping things the same, but from flowing with change. Not from attachment to place, but from being at home everywhere. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider your own nests. What are you clinging to, thinking it will keep you secure? What are you afraid to lose, believing that losing it would destroy your safety? What if real security came not from accumulating and protecting, but from developing the ability to adapt, to let go, to find shelter in new circumstances? You don't need to own peace to experience it. You don't need to build happiness to feel it. You don't need to nest in any particular circumstance to be okay. Like the brown bird, you can be at home in the whole forest of life, finding rest wherever you are, secure not in things staying the same, but in your to flow with whatever comes. Let go of your nest tonight. You don't need it to rest. The whole forest is yours. Every moment offers shelter if you're not too attached to the shelter of the previous moment. Rest in change. Rest in uncertainty. Rest in the knowing that you can adapt can find what you need, can be okay without controlling everything. That's real security. And it's lighter than any nest could ever be. In the capital city lived a tea master named Soho, who had spent 50 years perfecting the art of the tea ceremony. His movements were flawless, his timing exact, his aesthetic sense refined beyond what most people could achieve in several lifetimes. Every detail of his ceremonies was considered and precise. The angle of the bowl, the temperature of the water, the moment to pass the tea, the positioning of each implement. Soho's ceremonies were legendary. People would wait years for an invitation to attend. Wealthy patrons offered fortunes to have Soho perform ceremonies for their guests. Other tea masters studied his techniques, trying to replicate his perfection. But Soho himself had grown troubled. Despite his technical mastery, despite the acclaim, he felt his ceremonies had become performances rather than genuine expressions of tea mind. He was so focused on executing each movement perfectly that he had lost connection to the spirit beneath the movements. His ceremonies were flawless, but somehow empty. On his 70th birthday, Soho decided to retire from public ceremonies. He would perform one final tea ceremony, a farewell to his long career, and then step away to live simply in a small temple. He prepared meticulously for this final ceremony. He invited only his closest students and a few respected elders who had followed his work for decades. He selected implements he had used for years, choosing each for its history and meaning. He practiced the movements daily in the weeks leading up to the ceremony, ensuring everything would be perfect. The day of the ceremony arrived. Soho entered the tea room with his usual grace, began with his usual precision. His guests watched in respectful silence, knowing they were witnessing a master's final performance. Then, midway through the ceremony, something unexpected happened. As Soho reached for the tea bowl, his hand trembled slightly. Whether from age, emotion, or simple nervousness, he couldn't say. The tremor caused him to fumble the bowl. It didn't fall or break, but his grip was clumsy, his movement awkward. The flow of the ceremony was disrupted by this imperfect moment. Soho's first instinct was mortification. After 50 years of perfect execution, his final ceremony was marred by a clumsy mistake. But then something shifted in him. The mistake had broken his focus on perfection, and in that break, he suddenly felt present in a way he hadn't been during a ceremony in years. He picked up the bowl, not with perfect grace, but with simple honesty, with the actual movement of an old man holding a bowl. He continued the ceremony, but something had changed. He was no longer performing perfectly. He was just making tea, sharing tea, being present with his guests. The movements that followed weren't as technically flawless as usual, but they had a quality his perfect performances had lacked. They were real. They were Soho actually being here, making tea, connecting with his guests, rather than Soho executing a perfect reproduction of the tea master role. When the ceremony ended, there was a long silence. Then one of the elder guests spoke. "That was the finest tea ceremony I have ever experienced." Soho was confused. "But I made mistakes. The execution wasn't clean." "The execution was finally clean," the elder replied. "Clean of performance, clean of ego, clean of the need to be perfect. For the first time in decades, I saw you actually making tea rather than demonstrating how tea should be made." Your fumble was the most important moment of the ceremony. It dropped you out of performance and into presence. Another guest agreed. I've attended 6 of your ceremonies over the years. They were all technically superior to today's, but this one touched me in a way the others never did. The imperfection made it human. It made it real. It made it about tea rather than about perfection. Soho sat with this feedback for a long time. He realized that his 50-year pursuit of perfect execution had taken him away from genuine expression. He had become so skilled at performing the tea ceremony that he had forgotten how to simply make tea with presence and care. I thought mastery meant perfect execution, Soho told his students later. I thought the goal was to perform each movement so exactly that no flaw could be found. But that kind of mastery is dead. It's impressive but not alive. Today, when I fumbled and had to let go of perfection, I finally rediscovered what tea ceremony is actually about. Presence, connection, the simple act of sharing tea with other humans. He looked at his hands, still slightly trembling. These old hands that made a mistake taught me more than 50 years of perfect practice. They taught me that perfect execution becomes perfect only when you stop trying to perfect it, when you let go of performance and sink into presence. One student asked, "So should we not practice? Should we not work toward technical excellence?" "Practice," Soho replied. "Develop your technique. But don't let technique become an end in itself. Practice until the movements are natural, then let go of trying to perform them perfectly. Use your technique to support presence, not to replace it. Master the form so completely that you can forget the form and just be here, making tea." He picked up a tea bowl, holding it with the same slight tremble. "See this imperfection? This is actually perfection because it's real. It's an old man's hand actually holding a bowl. The steady, flawless grip I cultivated for decades was impressive, but it was also a kind of lie it hid my actual hand behind a perfect performance. This trembling hand is honest, and honesty is more important than perfection." In the weeks following his final ceremony, Soho began making tea in a completely different way. He still had all his technical skills, all his aesthetic sensitivity, but he used them lightly, allowing imperfection, welcoming the unexpected, staying present with what was actually happening rather than executing a mental script. He made tea for strangers, for children, for anyone who wanted to share a bowl. These weren't formal ceremonies with guests and perfect settings. They were just tea, made with care, shared with presence. And people felt more touched by these simple offerings than they had by his legendary perfect ceremonies. "You've become a greater tea master by letting go of mastery," one visitor observed. "I've become an actual tea master by letting go of the performance of mastery," Soho clarified. "I was skilled before, but I wasn't real. Now I'm both skilled and real. The skill supports the reality rather than replacing it. That's the difference." A young tea student struggling to perfect his own technique asked Soho for guidance. "How do I know when my practice is good enough? When can I stop trying to perfect my movements? When perfection becomes a barrier rather than a path," Soho replied. "Practice until the movements are natural and trustworthy. Then let go of trying to make them perfect and just let them be. The movement from practice to performance to presence, that's the journey. Most people stop at performance, endlessly perfecting their execution. The final step is letting go of perfection and discovering presence. He made tea for the young student, his hands moving with practiced skill, but also with slight tremors, small imperfections, human reality. See how I make tea now? I'm not performing or demonstrating, I'm just making tea. The years of practice allow me to do it well, but letting go of perfection allows me to do it truly. Both are necessary, but the second is what makes it complete. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what you've been perfecting, performing, trying to execute flawlessly. What would happen if you let your hands tremble slightly? If you allowed imperfection? If you stopped performing mastery and just did the thing itself, present and real? Perfect execution is impressive, but presence is what actually connects, what actually matters, what actually makes any practice complete. You've practiced enough, you've refined enough. Now it's time to let go of perfection and discover what's on the other side. Not sloppiness, not carelessness, but genuine presence that includes both skill and imperfection, both mastery and humanity. Rest now in this completion. Let yourself fumble slightly. Let yourself be real rather than perfect. The Tea Master's Last Cup teaches that the journey ends not in flawless execution, but in authentic presence. You've arrived, not at perfection, but at something better, yourself, skilled and real, doing what you do with care and presence, and the slight tremble of actual human hands. That's perfection. That's the completion. That's the teaching. Sleep now, no longer performing, just being. This is enough. You are enough. The perfect becomes perfect when you stop trying to perfect it. As our exploration of Zen Buddhism deepens, let us listen to a story that reveals how true worth is often overlooked. Here starts the next story. In a village where strong winds frequently blew down from the mountains, there was a grove of trees that included many different species. There were tall, rigid pines that stood straight and proud. There were sturdy oaks with thick trunks and strong branches. And among these impressive trees, there grew a single weeping willow, whose branches hung down gracefully, swaying with every breeze. A young carpenter named Riku would come to this grove to select wood for his work. He admired the strong, straight pines and the solid oaks. These were trees that stood firm against the wind, that didn't bend or yield, that maintained their position no matter what the weather came. This, Riku thought, was what strength looked like. The weeping willow he barely noticed, and when he did, he pitied it. Its branches drooped instead of reaching proudly skyward. It swayed and bent with every wind. It seemed weak, yielding, almost pathetic compared to the strong trees around it. Then one year, a great storm came. The wind howled down from the mountains with unprecedented force. The rain fell in sheets. Lightning split the sky. For 3 days and 3 nights, the storm raged. When it finally passed, Riku went to the grove to see what wood might be available from fallen trees. What he found shocked him. The strong pines, so tall and proud, had snapped like twigs. Their rigid trunks had broken under the force of the wind. The sturdy oaks had been uprooted, their strong but inflexible branches torn away. All across the grove lay the wreckage of trees that had stood firm, refused to yield, and had been destroyed for their rigidity. But the weeping willow still stood. Its branches, which had seemed so weak because they bent and swayed, had flexed with the wind rather than breaking against it. The tree that had appeared most fragile had survived when all the apparently strong trees had fallen. Riku sat beside the willow, looking at the destruction around it, trying to understand what he was seeing. Everything he thought he knew about strength was being challenged. The rig had broken. The yielding had survived. An old Buddhist nun named Kei was walking through the grove, surveying the damage from the storm. She saw Riku sitting in confusion and joined him. "The storm taught you something," she said. "I don't understand," Riku replied. "The strong trees broke. The weak ones survived. How can that be?" "You're confusing rigidity with strength," Kei said gently, "and flexibility with weakness. These are not the same things." She touched one of the willow's drooping branches. "This tree looks weak because it bends. But bending is what saved it." The rigid trees fought against the wind, trying to stand firm, refusing to yield. And the wind broke them. The willow didn't fight. It bent with the wind, yielded to forces it couldn't resist, and in that yielding, found the strength to survive. Riku listened carefully as Kei continued. "There's a principle in martial arts called Ju, which means gentleness or flexibility. The idea is that you don't meet force with force. You don't try to be harder than what's hitting you. Instead, you yield. You move with the energy coming at you. You redirect it rather than blocking it. This isn't a weakness. It's a different kind of strength." She gestured to the broken pines. These trees were strong in one way, but their strength was brittle. They could stand firm against normal winds, but when a force greater than their resistance came, they broke. The willow's strength is different. It has no brittleness because it has no rigidity. It can't break because it never stops bending. Over the following weeks, Riku began to see this principle everywhere. He watched how water, soft and yielding, could wear away stone over time. He noticed how the most rigid people in the village were often the most fragile when things didn't go their way. He observed how the people who could adapt and bend were often the ones who survived life's storms most intact. He changed his approach to carpentry. Instead of always seeking the hardest, most rigid woods, he began to appreciate woods with some flexibility, some give. He learned to work with the wood's natural tendencies rather than trying to force it into shapes it didn't want to take. His furniture became known for being both strong and graceful, able to bear weight while having a quality of flow and ease. But the deeper lesson was about how he lived his own life. Riku had always prided himself on being firm in his opinions, rigid in his principles, unwavering in his positions. He thought this made him strong, but he began to realize it made him brittle. When his wife suggested a different approach to something, his first instinct had always been to resist, to stand firm in his original idea. Now he began to consider, what if yielding wasn't losing? What if listening and adjusting weren't weaknesses but wisdom? When a client wanted changes to a piece he was building, instead of rigidly defending his design, he would flex, adapt, and incorporate their ideas. Often, the result was better than what he had planned. His yielding led to better outcomes than his resistance ever had. When life didn't go according to his plans, instead of fighting against reality, insisting things should be different, he began to bend with what was happening, to adapt, to find ways to work with circumstances rather than against them. A young man from the village came to Riku seeking advice. "Everyone tells me I need to be strong, to stand firm, to never back down. But I don't feel strong when I do that. I feel brittle, like I'm about to break." Riku took him to see the weeping willow. The tree had grown even larger in the years since the storm, its graceful branches now spreading wide. "This tree survived a storm that destroyed every tree around it," Riku said. "Not because it was harder or more rigid, but because it knew how to yield. Look at how it moves with this breeze. It doesn't fight the wind, it dances with it." He touched one of the branches, pulling it down and watching it spring back when he released it. True strength includes flexibility. The ability to bend without breaking, to yield without collapsing, to adapt without losing your essential nature. The willow yields, but it doesn't uproot. It bends, but it doesn't break. This is a strength that lasts. The young man asked, "But how do you know when to stand firm and when to bend? Don't some things require us to be rigid, to not yield?" "Yes," Riku acknowledged. "The willow has strong roots. It's flexible in its branches, but grounded in its foundation. The key is knowing what's essential and what's not. Your core values, your true nature, these are like the willow's roots. They ground you, but your opinions, your plans, your preferences, these can be like the branches. They can bend, adapt, yield without threatening who you fundamentally are." He gestured to where the oak and pine had once stood. These trees tried to keep everything rigid. Every branch, every position. They couldn't distinguish between what was essential to hold firm and what could be released. So when the great test came, they lost everything. The willow knew what to hold and what to release. It held its roots and released its branches to the wind. That's wisdom. Years later, the weeping willow became a teaching symbol in the village. Parents would bring children to see it, telling them the story of the great storm. Teachers would use it to illustrate the difference between rigidity and strength. Couples in conflict would sit beneath it, reminding themselves that yielding to each other wasn't losing, but creating a relationship that could weather storms. Riku, now an old man, would still visit the willow regularly. He had learned his lesson deeply. His life had brought many storms, many winds that could have broken him if he had stood rigid against them. But he had learned to bend, to yield, to move with forces he couldn't resist. And like the willow, he had survived, even thrived, not despite his flexibility, but because of it. One day, a master carpenter from the capital came to the village seeking Riku's advice. "I'm known for my rigid standards, my unwillingness to compromise," the master said. "But I'm miserable, and my relationships are all strained. People say I should learn from you." Riku took him to the willow. "What do you see?" "A tree with drooping branches. It looks weak." "It's the only tree that survived the great storm. Everything that looked strong broke. This tree that looks weak stood firm, not through rigidity, but through flexibility." He let this sink in before continuing. "Your rigidity feels like strength because you're in control, imposing your will, but it's actually brittleness. When life brings forces stronger than your will, you'll break. Learn to bend. Learn to yield. Not in your core principles, but in your attachment to having everything your way. True mastery includes knowing when to stand firm and when to flow. Tonight, as you rest, notice where you're holding rigid. What positions are you gripping too tightly? What plans are you clinging to that life is asking you to release? Where might you need to be more like the weeping willow, yielding to forces you can't control, bending so you don't break? Strength isn't always about standing firm. Sometimes it's about flowing with what comes. Sometimes the greatest power is in yielding, adapting, and moving with life, rather than against it. The willow survives because it doesn't fight battles it can't win. It bends, knowing that bending isn't breaking. Let yourself bend tonight. Let yourself yield to rest, to uncertainty, to whatever is. Don't be rigid in your expectations of how this should feel or what should happen. Flow like the willow's branches in the wind, trusting that your roots are strong enough to hold you even as you move with forces beyond your control. Yielding isn't weakness, it's wisdom. And tonight, it's the way to deep rest. Continuing along the path of Zen insight, we pause now to hear a teaching about perception and hidden value. Listen carefully to the next story. In a mountain village famous for its textiles, there was a master weaver named Chio who created cloth of extraordinary beauty. Her patterns were intricate, her colors perfectly balanced, her technique flawless. People would travel for days to commission work from her loom, and her pieces hung in the homes of nobles throughout the province. Then, one winter morning, Chio woke to find her hands had stiffened with arthritis. The pain was intense, but worse was the loss of the fine motor control that her craft demanded. She could no longer work the shuttle with her usual precision. The delicate adjustments that created her signature patterns were now impossible. For a weaver, this seemed like a death sentence. Chio's entire identity, her life's work, her purpose, all depended on her hands. Now those hands betrayed her, refusing to do what she commanded. She sat before her loom for hours, weeping, unable to imagine a future without her craft. Days turned to weeks. The loom sat silent. Chio refused visitors, refused commissions, refused to even look at the beautiful threads that had once brought her such joy. Her apprentice, a young woman named Nao, came regularly, begging Chio to teach her, to at least pass on knowledge if she could no longer create. But Chio sent her away each time. "What's the point?" she would say. "Without my hands, I have nothing to teach. I am nothing." One day, Nao arrived with a request that Chio couldn't refuse. A small child from the village was sick, and his mother had asked if Chio might weave even a simple cloth for the child's comfort. "She doesn't expect your fine work," Nao said gently. "She just wants something made by you, even if it's rough. She believes your cloth has healing in it." Chio couldn't say no to a sick child, so she returned to her loom for the first time in months. Her stiff hands struggled with the shuttle. The tension was uneven. The pattern she attempted came out distorted. Everything her hands produced now was clumsy, imperfect, wrong. But she continued, driven by compassion for the child. She created a simple blanket, nothing like her former masterpieces. The weave was loose, the pattern irregular, the whole piece marked by the limitations of her arthritic hands. She wrapped it with shame, certain the mother would be disappointed. When Nao delivered the blanket, the mother held it and began to cry. "It's perfect," she said. Tell Chio it's the most beautiful thing she's ever made. Now brought this message back to Chio, who couldn't believe it. How could that rough, imperfect work be beautiful? It's everything I spent my life learning not to create. The mother said she could feel the struggle in it, now reported. She said she could feel your hands fighting to create something despite the pain. She said it reminded her that beautiful things can emerge from difficulty, that limitation doesn't mean the end of creation. Her child is struggling too, and she said this cloth would remind him that struggle can still produce beauty. This response shook something loose in Chio's understanding. She had thought beauty required perfection, that her arthritic hands could only produce inferior work. But this mother had seen a different kind of beauty, the beauty of creation despite limitation, of persistence through difficulty, of love expressed through imperfect means. Chio returned to her loom with a new perspective. She stopped trying to create what her hands could no longer produce and started exploring what they could produce. The patterns that emerged were unlike anything she had made before. They were asymmetrical, organic, and marked by the randomness of her unpredictable hand movements. They told stories of struggle and adaptation, of beauty that included rather than denied imperfection. People noticed something profound in this new work. Her earlier pieces had been technically superior, but these new pieces touched something deeper. They were relatable in a way perfection never is. They spoke of being human, of limitations, of finding beauty not despite obstacles, but through them. "Your old work was impressive," one patron told her. "This new work is moving. I look at your perfect pieces and admire them. I look at these new pieces and feel understood." Chio began teaching again, but with a transformed philosophy. "I spent 30 years pursuing perfection," she would tell students. "I thought my value as a weaver came from my technical mastery. But arthritis stripped that away and showed me something more important. That beauty doesn't require perfection. That limitation can reveal new possibilities. That the work of imperfect hands can touch hearts in ways that perfect technique never could." She would show students her early work alongside her later work. "These first pieces show what skilled hands can do. These later pieces show what love can do with whatever hands you have. Which is more valuable?" The answer isn't obvious. Now, who had continued as her apprentice through all these changes, asked one day, "Do you wish you could have your old hands back? Do you miss being able to create perfectly?" Chio thought for a long time before answering. "I miss the ease of it," she said honestly. "I miss not feeling pain with every movement, but I don't miss who I was when perfection came easily." That Chio was skilled but narrow. She understood only one kind of beauty. This Chio, with her stiff, painful hands, understands more. The arthritis took my technical perfection, but it gave me depth I never had before. She held up her gnarled hands. "These hands taught me what my young, nimble hands never could, that obstacles refine what truly matters. When I could create anything, I created what was impressive. Now that I can only create with difficulty, I create what's true." The limitation stripped away everything superficial and left only what's essential. Years passed, and Chio's hands grew worse. Eventually, she could barely work the loom at all, but by then her teaching had become as valued as her weaving once was. She taught people to see obstacles not as endings but as refinements, not as barriers, but as editors that remove what's unnecessary and reveal what's essential. Every limitation is a teacher, she would say. It shows you what really matters by taking away what doesn't. My hands took away my technical mastery and revealed that mastery was never the point. The point was always connection, expression, and the creation of beauty that touches hearts. I can do that with arthritic hands. I just had to learn a different language of beauty. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider your own limitations, your own obstacles, your own arthritic hands. What has been taken from you that felt essential? What can you no longer do that once defined you? These losses aren't just subtractions. They're refinements, removing what's superficial to reveal what's essential. Your obstacles are teaching you something. They're stripping away the easy answers, the impressive exteriors, the technical perfections that never touched anyone's heart anyway. What remains, what you can still do despite your limitations, that's what truly matters. That's where your real beauty lives. Rest now in acceptance of your arthritic hands, your imperfect instruments, your limited capacities. They're not preventing beauty. They're refining it, teaching it, revealing it in forms you never would have discovered through ease and perfection. The weaver's silent loom eventually spoke with more power than her perfect one ever did. Your limitations will teach you the same truth if you let them. In a coastal village where dangerous rocks lurked beneath the waves, there stood a lighthouse that had saved countless ships from destruction. The lighthouse keeper was a man named Tomo, who had tended the light faithfully for 20 years, never missing a night, never letting the beacon fail. Tomo took great pride in his work. Each evening as he lit the lamp, he would think about the ships that would see his light and know where the safe passage lay. He imagined grateful sailors steering clear of the rocks because of his vigilance. His purpose was clear, his contribution visible, his worth measured in ships that arrived safely rather than wrecking on the shore. But then came a period in Tomo's life when everything fell apart. His wife died after a long illness. His adult son, with whom he'd been close, moved to a distant city and rarely wrote. His closest friend in the village passed away suddenly. Within the span of 6 months, Tomo lost everyone who mattered most to him. He fell into a deep despair. He no longer felt the satisfaction he once had in his work. The lighthouse seemed meaningless, his life empty, his purpose hollow. He felt lost, as if he were stumbling through darkness with no light to guide him, no sense of direction, no hope that things would improve. Yet, despite his inner darkness, Tomo continued to light the lighthouse every night. It was a habit, a duty, the automatic continuation of what he had always done. But there was no joy in it anymore, no sense of meaning. He lit the lamp because that's what lighthouse keepers do, not because he felt it mattered. He would stand in the lamp room at night, watching the light sweep across the dark water, and think, I'm supposed to be the one providing light, but I'm drowning in darkness. I'm supposed to guide others to safety, but I'm completely lost in myself. What right do I have to stand here pretending to know the way when I can't find my own path? One stormy night, as Tomo stood in the lamp room feeling particularly hopeless, there was a knock at the lighthouse door. He descended to find a sailor, soaking wet, nearly hypothermic, who had been thrown from his ship when a wave swept over the deck. "I saw your light," the sailor gasped as Tomo pulled him inside. "I was in the water, being pulled toward the rocks. I thought I was going to die. Then I saw your light, and I swam toward it. Your light saved my life." Tomo brought the man warm clothes, hot tea, and blankets. As the sailor recovered by the fire, he kept repeating his gratitude. "If your light hadn't been there, I would have been smashed against the rocks. I couldn't see anything else, but I could see your light. It showed me which way to swim." After the sailor left the next morning, rescued by his ship, which had returned looking for him, Tomo sat for a long time thinking about what had happened. He had been so focused on his own inner darkness that he had forgotten what his light actually did. It didn't require him to feel enlightened. It didn't need him to be free of darkness himself. It just needed to shine. The sailor didn't care that the lighthouse keeper was lost and grieving. The sailor didn't need Tomo to have all the answers or to be living a perfect life. The sailor just needed the light to be there, marking the safe passage, showing where the dangers were. A Zen monk who lived at the village had heard about the rescued sailor. He came to visit Tomo at the lighthouse. "I've noticed you've been struggling," the monk said gently. "Since your losses, I see the darkness in you." Tomo nodded, too tired to pretend otherwise. "I light this beacon every night, but I feel like a fraud. How can I guide others when I'm lost myself? How can I provide light when I'm full of darkness?" The monk looked up at the lamp tower. "Does the lighthouse need to understand navigation to be useful? Does it need to have sailed all the seas to show where the rocks are? Does it need to feel happy and fulfilled to save lives?" "No," Tomo admitted. "It just needs to shine." "Exactly," the monk said. "You think your inner darkness disqualifies you from helping others, but actually, your willingness to keep the light burning despite your darkness makes your service even more valuable. You're not helping others because you have everything figured out. You're helping them because you do what needs to be done, regardless of how you feel." He touched Tomo's shoulder. Many people believe they can't help others until they're completely healed themselves. Until they've solved all their problems, found all their answers, achieved enlightenment or happiness or wholeness. But if everyone waited until they were completely well before helping others, no one would ever help anyone. We're all broken in some way. We're all stumbling in the darkness of one kind or another. But we can still hold lights for each other. Tomo felt something shift inside him. "You're saying I can be lost and still guide others?" "You already are," the monk replied. "You've been doing it every night. Your grief, your despair, your sense of being lost, none of that prevented the light from shining. None of that stopped you from doing what needed to be done. You think you're a fraud because you're suffering while helping others. But actually, you're demonstrating something important. Service doesn't require personal perfection. It requires showing up and doing what needs to be done." Over the following weeks, Tomo began to see his work differently. He was still grieving. He still felt lost much of the time. The darkness inside him hadn't disappeared. But he understood now that his inner state didn't invalidate his outer contribution. Ships still needed guidance. The light still saved lives. His pain didn't make the light less bright. He thought about all the people who probably felt as he did, broken, lost, inadequate, questioning their right to help others when they themselves were struggling. How many people stopped offering their gifts because they felt they weren't whole enough, healed enough, enlightened enough? A young woman from the village came to him one day troubled. She was training to be a healer, but felt overwhelmed by her own anxieties and doubts. "How can I help heal others when I'm so broken myself?" she asked. Tomo took her up to the lamp room and showed her the light. This lighthouse doesn't need to be whole to be useful. It just needs to do its job. You don't need to have conquered all your fears and healed all your wounds to help others. You just need to offer what you can offer. Your brokenness doesn't disqualify you from service. Sometimes it actually makes you better at it because you understand suffering from the inside. He told her about the sailor he had saved while feeling completely lost. The sailor didn't need me to be happy. He needed me to keep the light on. The people you help won't need you to be perfect. They'll need you to offer your skills, your compassion, your presence, whatever you're capable of giving. And you can give those things even while you're struggling. Word spread about the lighthouse keeper's teaching. People who had been holding back from helping others because of their own problems began to reconsider. The teacher who was battling depression realized she could still teach well, that her students didn't need her to be joyful, just knowledgeable and present. The counselor struggling with his own failed marriage recognized he could still help other couples, that his challenges didn't erase his insights. The mentor, dealing with doubt about his own life choices, saw that he could still guide younger people. That uncertainty about his own path didn't prevent him from illuminating options for others. Tomoe's grief gradually softened over time. Years passed, and while he never stopped missing his wife and feeling the absence of his son, the acute pain dulled into a quieter sadness. The darkness inside him became less consuming. But he never forgot the lesson of that period, that he had kept the light burning through his darkest time, that ships had been saved even while he felt lost, that his inner darkness hadn't stopped the outward light. One evening, many years later, an old sailor came to the lighthouse. "Do you remember me?" the sailor asked. "You saved my life 20 years ago. I was thrown overboard in a storm. I saw your light and swam to it." Tomoe did remember. That was the night I needed most to know that what I was doing mattered. "Well, it mattered," the sailor said. "I went on to have a family. 3 children, 7 grandchildren now. All of them exist because you kept that light burning. And you know what I learned that night? I learned that when you're drowning in darkness, you don't need someone who has all the answers. You just need someone who's holding a light, even if they're struggling to hold it, even if they're not sure why they're bothering. You just need the light. It doesn't matter if the keeper is lost. It matters that the light is there." Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what lights you've been withholding because you feel too broken to offer them. What help have you refused to give because you don't feel qualified, whole, or enlightened enough? What guidance have you withheld because you yourself feel lost? You don't need to have everything figured out to help someone else. You don't need to be healed completely to offer healing. You don't need to be free of darkness to hold light for others. The lighthouse keeper's inner darkness didn't stop ships from being saved. Your inner struggles don't invalidate the contribution you can make. Keep your light burning, even in your dark nights. Not because you're perfect, but because someone out there is swimming in darkness toward whatever light they can find. Your light might be the one that saves them. And it doesn't matter that you feel lost. It only matters that you're still showing up, still doing what you can do, still offering what you can offer. Rest now in the understanding that you can be broken and still be useful, lost and still guide others, full of darkness and still provides light. The lighthouse doesn't need to understand the journey to mark the safe passage. It just needs to keep shining. So do you. Your inner darkness doesn't disqualify you from helping others. Sometimes it's what qualifies you most, because you understand what it's like to need a light in the darkness. Sleep now, lighthouse keeper, knowing that even in your darkest nights, your light has been saving lives. It always has been. It always will be. As we drift deeper into the still waters of Zen, a quiet teaching begins to rise, one that speaks of clarity and of value not always seen. Listen gently now. The next story begins. In a coastal city, there lived a renowned mapmaker named Genji, who had charted more territory than any cartographer of his generation. His maps were detailed, accurate, and highly sought after by merchants, explorers, and military leaders. Every island, every coastline, every mountain range he documented was rendered with precision. But Genji had a practice that other mapmakers mocked. Whenever his knowledge ended, whenever he reached the limits of what had been explored and documented, he would leave the map blank. Large white spaces appeared on his charts, marked only with the words "unknown territory," or sometimes just left empty. Other mapmakers found this approach unprofessional. They would fill in the blank spaces with speculation, with reports from unreliable sources, with educated guesses. A map should be complete, they would argue. Blank spaces make it look unfinished. Blank spaces are honest, Genji would reply. They tell the truth, that we don't know what's there. Filling them with guesses tells a lie, that we do know. But the criticism stung, especially when clients would choose other mapmakers' complete maps over Genji's honest but incomplete ones. People wanted certainty, even false certainty. They wanted maps that told them what lay everywhere, even if those maps were partly fiction. One season, a wealthy merchant named Ichiro commissioned Genji to create a map for a trading expedition to distant islands. When Genji delivered the map, Ichiro was dismayed by the large blank areas. "What am I supposed to do with this?" Ichiro complained. "I need to know what's in these blank spaces. I need to plan my route." "What's in those spaces is unknown," Genji replied. "No reliable expedition has charted them. I can't tell you what I don't know." "But other mapmakers have filled in these areas," Ichiro protested. "They show islands, harbors, channels." "Based on speculation," Genji said. "Based on second-hand rumors and wishful thinking. If you sail using those maps, you'll be navigating by fantasy. My blank spaces at least tell you where certainty ends." Ichiro hired a different map maker who provided a complete map with no blank spaces. The expedition set sail using this fully detailed chart, confident in their route. 3 months later, the expedition returned, having lost 2 ships. They had found islands where the map showed open ocean, encountered reefs where the map showed safe passage, and wasted weeks exploring channels that didn't exist. The complete map had been worse than useless. It had been dangerous. Ichiro returned to Genji, chastened. "Your blank spaces would have saved lives. If I had known we were entering unknown territory, I would have proceeded cautiously. Instead, I trusted a map that pretended to know, and that false certainty led to disaster." Blank spaces scare people, Genji acknowledged. They remind us how much we don't know, how limited our understanding is. But pretending we know more than we do is worse than admitting our ignorance. The blank space says, "Be careful here. Proceed thoughtfully. Don't assume." The falsely filled space says, "It's safe to trust this," which is a dangerous lie. Word spread about Ichiro's disaster and Genji's honest maps. More clients began to value the blank spaces, recognizing them as marks of integrity rather than incompleteness. They learned to read Genji's maps differently. The detailed areas showed where knowledge was reliable. The blank areas showed where caution was needed. A young apprentice named Lin came to study with Genji. She had been trained by other map makers who filled in all spaces, and she struggled with Genji's insistence on leaving blanks. "But we can make educated guesses," Lin argued. "We know the general geography of the region. We can estimate where islands are likely to be." "And we'd be wrong half the time," Genji replied. "An educated guess isn't knowledge. It's speculation with a fancy name. If you mark speculation as if it's fact, you're lying to whoever uses your map." He spread out several maps on his table, his own with its blank spaces, and competitors' maps of the same regions with every space filled. These complete maps look more professional, more finished. But which is more honest? Which better serves someone trusting their life to the information? Lin began to understand, but still she resisted. People don't want to be told we don't know. They want answers, even imperfect ones. Then they want comforting lies rather than uncomfortable truths, Genji said. And it's not our job to provide comforting lies. Our job is to chart what's known and clearly mark what's not. The blank space is information. It tells you something important. Here be dragons, or at least here be unknowns. Proceed carefully. Over time, Lin learned to value the blank spaces. She discovered that leaving areas blank required as much skill as filling them in. You had to know exactly where certainty ended, had to resist the temptation to extend your knowledge beyond its actual limits, and had to be comfortable with admitting you didn't have all the answers. One day, an explorer returned from a region Genji had left blank on his maps. The explorer had detailed charts of what was actually there. "Your blank space wasn't really blank," the explorer said, showing Genji islands and coastlines that had been unknown before. "Now it's not blank," Genji agreed, carefully adding the new information to his map. "But it was blank until you explored it. That's how honest maps work. They grow as knowledge grows, but they never pretend to knowledge we don't have." He looked at the transformed map. "See how the blank space has been replaced with detail. That's how it should happen. First honest acknowledgement of ignorance, then actual exploration, then knowledge replacing the unknown." But some map makers skip the first step and go straight to filling in spaces with imagination, which prevents anyone from recognizing what actually needs to be explored. Years later, Genji's blank spaces became the very thing that made his maps valuable. Explorers would deliberately seek out the blank spaces on Genji's maps, knowing these marked genuinely unexplored territory rather than cartographic guesswork. Military leaders trusted Genji's maps precisely because they showed where trust should end. A historian interviewing Genji late in his life asked, "Don't the blank spaces bother you? Don't you wish you could fill in all the unknown areas before you die?" "No," Genji replied without hesitation. "The blank spaces are the most honest things on my maps. They say, 'I don't know,' which is often the truest thing a person can say. I could fill them with speculation and fantasy, making maps that look complete. But I'd rather make true maps." He gestured to his life's work, hundreds of maps, all marked with careful detail where knowledge existed and honest blankness where it didn't. These blank spaces are my legacy. They're me admitting the limits of my knowledge, refusing to pretend omniscience, valuing truth over completeness. Every mapmaker who fills in the unknown with guesses is choosing ego over integrity. I choose integrity. The historian looked at a particularly large blank space on one map. "Will this ever be filled in?" "Perhaps," Genji said. "Perhaps someone will explore that region and bring back reliable information, or perhaps it will remain blank forever. Either way, my map is honest right now, which is all any map can be." The mapmaker who fills in that space with speculation is making a map that's dishonest right now, in the hope that by accident he might be correct later. That's not mapmaking. That's gambling. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider the blank spaces in your own understanding. Where are you filling in unknowns with speculation, pretending certainty you don't have, telling yourself and others you know things you actually don't? What would it mean to leave those spaces blank, to honestly mark them as unknown? The blank space isn't a failure. It's honesty. It's saying, "I don't know," instead of offering false certainty. It's admitting the limits of your understanding rather than pretending those limits don't exist. This feels vulnerable because we're taught that certainty is strength and uncertainty is weakness. But actually, false certainty is weakness disguised as strength, while honest uncertainty is strength willing to show itself. Rest now in your blank spaces. Let yourself not know what you don't know. Let yourself mark large areas of your life, your future, your understanding as unknown territory. This isn't an admission of failure, it's commitment to truth. The mapmaker with blank spaces serves better than the one with false completeness. So do you. Your honest "I don't know" is more valuable than anyone's false "I'm certain." Sleep in the blank spaces tonight where truth lives. In a mountain monastery lived an old abbess named Ren who kept in her private chamber an unusual mirror. The mirror was ancient, its surface darkened and worn until it reflected almost nothing. Visitors who saw it would often remark on its uselessness. "Your mirror shows nothing," they would say. "Why keep it? Get a new one that actually works." But Ren treasured this mirror and looked into it every morning. "It shows me exactly what I need to see," she would reply, though she never explained what she meant. One day, a vain young woman named Ayame came to the monastery seeking spiritual guidance. She was beautiful and knew it, spending hours each day on her appearance, constantly checking her reflection in every available surface. Her identity was completely wrapped up in her looks. During her first meeting with Ren, Ayame couldn't stop glancing at the darkened mirror, trying to catch a glimpse of herself. But the mirror showed nothing, just a dark, murky surface with barely a hint of reflection. "Your mirror is broken," Ayame said with annoyance. "Don't you want to see yourself?" "I see myself perfectly well in this mirror," Ren replied. "What do you see?" "Nothing. It's too dark." "Exactly," Ren said, and smiled. Ayame didn't understand, but as the days passed and she continued her stay at the monastery, she found herself repeatedly drawn to Ren's useless mirror. She would stand before it, searching for her reflection, finding almost nothing. It was deeply unsettling. Every other mirror showed her who she was, or at least showed her what she looked like. This mirror showed nothing. After a week, Ayame mentioned her frustration to Ren. "I hate your mirror. I keep looking into it hoping to see myself, but there's nothing there." "And what does that nothing teach you?" Ren asked. "That the mirror is broken." "Or that you're looking for the wrong thing," Ren suggested. "Every mirror you've ever looked into has shown you your face, your hair, your features. You've spent years studying that reflection, knowing exactly what you look like. My mirror can't show you that, so it forces you to consider, if you can't see your face, what else might you see? If appearance isn't available, what remains?" Ayame thought about this. When she looked into normal mirrors, she saw features she judged. Eyes too small, nose too sharp, skin not smooth enough. She saw an image she tried to perfect, control, improve. The looking was never really seeing. It was evaluating, criticizing, trying to manage how others would perceive her. But in Ren's dark mirror, there was nothing to evaluate, no features to judge, no appearance to control. Just dark surface and, if she looked very carefully, the barest hint of a form. Not details, just presence. "What do you see when you look in your mirror?" Ayame asked Ren. "Nothing that can be improved or criticized," Ren replied. "Nothing that age can diminish or beauty can enhance. Just the simple fact of being here, looking. The mirror that shows everything tempts you to judge what you see. The mirror that shows nothing releases you from judgment." She came to stand beside Ayame before the dark mirror. "Look at us now, standing here together. Can you see our faces?" "Barely," Ayame admitted. "Can you tell which of us is more beautiful?" "No." "Can you see our ages, our features, the details that usually define us?" "No." "Then we stand equal before this mirror," Ren said. "Not as beautiful or plain, young or old, but simply as two beings, present in this moment. The mirror that shows nothing strips away all the superficial ways we distinguish ourselves and leaves only the essential fact: we are here." Over the following weeks, Ayame found herself looking into Ren's mirror more than any of the clear mirrors in the monastery. At first, this puzzled her. Why would she choose the mirror that showed nothing? But gradually she understood. She was tired of the constant judgment that came with seeing her reflection clearly. Tired of always evaluating, always trying to improve, always wondering if she looked acceptable. The dark mirror gave her relief from all that. It let her be present without being perceived, even by herself. It let her exist without the burden of appearance. "I think I'm beginning to understand," Ayame told Ren one morning. The mirror that shows nothing is actually showing me something very important. That I exist independent of how I look. That there's a me underneath or beyond appearance. I've spent so many years focused on my reflection that I forgot there's someone doing the looking. Ren nodded with satisfaction. The mirror that shows everything directs your attention outward, to surface and appearance. The mirror that shows nothing directs your attention inward, to the awareness that's looking. One mirror shows you an object to be evaluated. The other mirror reveals you as a subject who is aware. She touched the darkened surface gently. Most people think a mirror's value is in how clearly it reflects. But sometimes a mirror's greatest value is in what it doesn't show. The absence of reflection can teach what the presence of reflection never could. Ayame stayed at the monastery for 6 months, and during that time, her relationship with mirrors changed completely. She no longer felt compelled to check her reflection constantly. When she did look in clear mirrors, she no longer saw an image to be judged, but simply a face, no more or less significant than any other face. "Your dark mirror freed me," she told Ren when she prepared to leave. "I thought I needed to see myself clearly to know who I was, but actually, seeing myself clearly kept me trapped in appearance, in judgment, in the endless work of managing how I looked. Your mirror that showed nothing helped me discover the me that exists beyond appearance." After Ayame left, other students asked Ren about the mirror's teaching. "Why not just remove all mirrors?" one asked. "If the point is to free people from attachment to appearance, why have mirrors at all?" "Because running from mirrors is still being controlled by them," Ren explained. "The person who avoids all mirrors is as attached to appearance as the person who constantly looks. They're just attached to not looking rather than to looking. The dark mirror teaches something different. It teaches how to look without judgment, how to be aware of appearance without being enslaved by it." She held up the darkened mirror for the students to see. "This mirror shows that appearance and essence are not the same. The clear mirror shows you appearance so clearly that you might mistake it for essence. This dark mirror removes appearance and asks, what remains? What are you when you can't see your face? That question leads to wisdom." A philosophical student asked, "But isn't the dark mirror just another form of illusion? It hides reality rather than revealing it." "Does it?" Ren replied. "The clear mirror shows you how light reflects off your features at this particular moment from this particular angle. Is that reality? Or is that also just one kind of information, one kind of seeing? The dark mirror shows you something the clear mirror can't. Your existence independent of your reflection. Both mirrors have their uses. The question is whether you're wise enough to learn from each what it has to teach." Years later, when Ren was dying, she gave the darkened mirror to her successor with specific instructions. "Keep this mirror, even though students will mock it, even though visitors will offer to replace it. This mirror teaches what cannot be taught in words, that sometimes absence reveals more than presence, that sometimes nothing shows more than everything, that sometimes the greatest wisdom comes from what we cannot see rather than from what we can." Tonight, as you rest, you might imagine looking into a mirror that shows nothing, not because the mirror is broken, but because it's teaching you something that clear mirrors never could. Without your reflection to evaluate and judge, what remains? Without your appearance to manage and improve, who are you? The mirror that shows nothing is inviting you to meet yourself beyond surface, beyond image, beyond all the ways you've learned to see yourself through others' eyes. In the dark mirror, there's just presence, just awareness, just the simple fact of being here without needing to look any particular way. Rest now in the dark mirror's teaching. Let yourself be unseen, unreflected, undefined by appearance. Let yourself exist in the space beyond image, where judgment can't reach, where evaluation has no meaning, where you simply are without needing to be any particular way. The mirror shows nothing, and in that nothing, everything essential is revealed. Sleep in that revelation tonight. With each breath, we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen, where the smallest stone may hold the greatest truth. Here starts the next story. In a city famous for its artists, there was a renowned sculptor named Kaori who had created magnificent works for temples, palaces, and public squares throughout the land. She was known for her perfectionism, her unwillingness to declare any work complete until every detail was exactly right. At age 60, Kaori received a commission that she knew would be her masterpiece, a memorial sculpture for the city's founder. She had complete artistic freedom and unlimited time. This would be her legacy, the work by which all her other work would be judged. She began with intense focus, creating preliminary sketches, building models, and selecting the perfect stone. The first year was spent in planning. The second year is spent roughing out the basic form. By the third year, the sculpture was recognizably taking shape as a figure of dignity and strength, capturing something essential about leadership and vision. But as the sculpture neared completion, something strange happened. Kaori couldn't finish it. Every time she thought she was done, she would see another adjustment to make, another detail to refine, another element that wasn't quite right. The nose could be more precise, the hands could be more expressive, the drapery could flow more naturally. Years passed. The sculpture stood in her studio, nearly complete, but never quite complete enough. City officials would visit, would ask when they might see the finished work, and Kaori would assure them it was almost ready, just a few more refinements needed. 10 years after beginning the project, Kaori was still working on the same sculpture. It had gone through countless iterations. Areas she had refined years earlier, she would redo, claiming her skills had improved, and she could do better now. The sculpture had become an obsession, a project that consumed her life but never reached completion. A young sculptor named Isamu, who admired Kaori's earlier work, came to apprentice with her. He expected to learn from watching a master complete her masterpiece. Instead, he found an old woman trapped in endless refinement, unable to stop working on a sculpture that had been nearly done for years. "Why don't you declare it finished?" Isamu finally asked, after watching Kaori rework the same hand for the third time since he arrived. "Because it's not perfect yet," Kaori replied. "I can see the ideal form in my mind. This stone version still falls short. I need to keep working until the stone matches the vision." "But will it ever match?" Isamu asked gently. "Will the real sculpture ever match the perfect one in your imagination?" Kaori had no answer. She had never asked herself this question. She had always assumed that with enough work, enough refinement, enough time, she could make the physical sculpture match her mental ideal. A Zen teacher named Etsuko, who had known Kaori for decades, visited the studio. She looked at the nearly complete sculpture with a sad expression. "You're destroying it," Etsuko said. "I'm perfecting it," Kaori protested. "No, you're overworking it. The sculpture lost its life years ago when you couldn't stop refining it. Now it's becoming tight, over-controlled, anxious. I can see your perfectionism in every surface. The early spontaneity is gone, replaced by compulsive detail." She touched the sculpture gently. Completion doesn't mean achieving perfection. It means recognizing when continuing diminishes rather than improves. This sculpture was probably finished 5 years ago, but you couldn't see it because you were comparing it to an impossible ideal rather than accepting it as the real thing it actually was. Kaori wanted to argue, but she knew Etsuko was right. She looked at her sculpture with honest eyes for the first time in years. It was beautiful in parts, overworked in others. The areas she had refined most recently were actually worse than earlier versions. Too controlled, too fussy, too perfect. The sculpture had lost its breath somewhere along the way. "How do I know when something is done?" Kaori asked quietly. "How do I distinguish between stopping because it's complete and stopping because I've given up?" "You feel it," Etsuko replied. "True completion has a quality of rightness, even if the work isn't perfect. Giving up has a quality of defeat. But what you're doing now is neither completion nor giving up. It's compulsive continuation, working past the point where work helps. That's different from both completion and abandonment." She looked at Kaori directly. The sculpture should have been installed in the city square years ago, where people would appreciate it. Instead, it's trapped in your studio, being endlessly refined toward an ideal it will never reach. You're preventing it from serving its purpose because you can't accept that it's good enough. That's not dedication to excellence. That's fear disguised as perfectionism. This truth landed hard. Kaori realized she had been afraid to finish the sculpture, afraid to have it judged, afraid it wouldn't live up to her reputation. As long as it remained unfinished in her studio, it remained perfect in potential. Once completed and installed, it would be real, subject to criticism, limited by its actual qualities rather than protected by its imagined ones. "I've been hiding," Kaori admitted, "calling it refinement when actually it was avoidance." With Etsuko's help, Kaori looked at the sculpture one more time and made a decision. She declared it complete as it was, not perfect, but real. She stopped working on it and arranged for its installation. When the sculpture was finally revealed in the city square, public response was mixed. Some people loved it. Others thought it was good, but not as exceptional as they'd expected from a decade of work. Critics noted both its strengths and its weaknesses. It was not a perfect masterpiece. It was a good sculpture with both beautiful passages and overworked areas, a real work rather than an ideal one. And Kaori found unexpected peace in this. The sculpture was done, installed, serving its purpose. It wasn't perfect, but it was complete. It had moved from endless potential to limited actuality, and this movement was itself a kind of perfection. Not the perfection of flawless execution, but the perfection of genuine completion. I spent 10 years trying to make it perfect, Kaori told Isamu, standing together, looking at the installed sculpture. I should have spent 3 years making it good, and then accepted that good was enough. The extra 7 years didn't make it better. They just delayed it. Isamu asked, "But how will you know with your next work? How will you know when to stop?" "I'll try to recognize when I'm working from love versus working from fear," Kaori said. "When I'm working from love, I'm responding to the actual piece, helping it become itself. When I'm working from fear, I'm trying to make it match an impossible ideal, trying to protect myself from criticism or judgment. The work from fear doesn't improve the piece. It just makes it tighter, more controlled, more dead." She touched a rough area of the sculpture that she had always intended to smooth further. "See this? For years I planned to refine it, but now I see it gives texture, life, contrast. My perfectionism wanted to eliminate it, but actually it's one of the better parts. Sometimes what we think is incomplete is actually just real, and real includes roughness, includes elements that don't match the ideal." In her remaining years, Kaori created several more sculptures, and each one she completed more quickly than the last. She learned to recognize the moment when a work was done, not perfect, but complete. She learned that completion meant allowing the work to be what it actually was, rather than endlessly pushing it toward what it might ideally be. "My final work taught me that sometimes completion means stopping, not finishing," she told students. "Sometimes good enough is actually excellent, because continuing would diminish rather than improve. Sometimes the work is done when you can let it go, not when it's perfect." Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what in your life needs completion rather than more refinement. What projects, relationships, phases, identities have you been endlessly working on, unable to declare them finished because they don't match your ideal? What would it mean to accept them as complete, as good enough, as done? Completion doesn't require perfection. It requires recognition that continuing is no longer serving the work or serving you. It requires courage to let the real thing exist, rather than protecting the imagined perfect thing by keeping it perpetually incomplete. Rest now in completion. Let yourself be done with some things, not because they're perfect, but because they're finished. Let yourself stop refining and start living with what actually is, rather than what might ideally be. The sculptor's final work teaches that holding on too long destroys as surely as letting go too early. Learn to recognize the difference. And then, when it's time, let go. At the edge of a village stood a house whose small garden received almost no direct sunlight. Tall buildings on either side cast shadows that leave the garden in shade for all but an hour each day. The previous owners had tried repeatedly to grow sun-loving flowers and vegetables, but everything either died or grew weak and spindly, stretching desperately toward the brief sliver of light. When Yuki moved into the house, neighbors warned her about the garden. "Nothing grows there," they said. "The shade is too deep. Better to pave it over and use it for storage." But Yuki looked at the shaded space differently. "It's not that nothing can grow here," she said. "It's that sun-loving plants can't grow here. The garden isn't bad. It's just suited for different things, than the previous owners were trying to grow. She began researching plants that thrived in shade, ferns that loved the dim moisture, hostas with broad leaves that caught what little light appeared, shade-loving flowers that bloomed in muted colors, but with delicate beauty. Instead of fighting the garden's nature, she worked with it. Within a year, Yuki's shaded garden was lush and beautiful. It didn't look like sunny gardens with their bright flowers and robust vegetables. It had a different aesthetic, subtle, cool, mysterious. The greens were deeper, the flowers were more delicate. The whole space had a quality of quiet richness that sun-blasted gardens never achieved. Neighbors who had declared the space hopeless came to see what Yuki had created. They were amazed, though some were still dismissive. "It's pretty," one neighbor said, "but it's not a real garden. Real gardens have tomatoes and sunflowers and bright colors. Your garden is just making the best of bad conditions." "Are it conditions bad?" Yuki asked. "Or just different conditions?" "These ferns and hostas are barely surviving. They're thriving. They're doing exactly what they evolved to do in exactly the kind of environment they need. The previous owners failed because they tried to grow sun plants in shade. I'm succeeding because I'm growing shade plants in shade." She touched a particularly lush fern. "This plant would die in full sun. It needs shade. For this fern, my garden isn't difficult conditions, it's ideal conditions. The mistake is measuring all gardens by sun garden standards and calling everything else deficient." A young woman named Hannah, who lived nearby, was struck by this perspective. Hannah had always felt like she was growing in the shade in difficult circumstances that made the kind of success others achieved impossible for her. She had health issues that limited her energy. She lived in poverty, which restricted her opportunities. She lacked the family support that others took for granted. Everyone told her she needed to overcome these limitations, to find more light, to transform her difficult conditions into easier ones. But what if, like Yuki's garden, she just needed to stop trying to grow like a sun plant and instead discover how to thrive as a shade plant? She came to talk with Yuki about this idea. "I feel like I'm always failing," Hannah admitted, "because I can't achieve what healthy, wealthy people with family support achieve. I'm trying to grow tomatoes in shade, basically. But I don't know what the equivalent of shade plants would be for a human life." Yuki walked her through the garden, explaining her choices. "See how I chose plants that need less energy? That's like you choosing work that fits your energy levels rather than jobs that demand more than you can give. See how I selected plants that thrive in cool, moist conditions? That's like you finding strengths that develop specifically because of your limitations, not despite them." She pointed to a particularly beautiful shade flower. "This would never survive in full sun. Its delicate petals would burn. But here, protected from harsh light, it blooms with a beauty that sun lovers can't achieve." Your limitations might protect you from certain kinds of harm while allowing you to develop qualities that people in easier conditions never develop. Hannah began to reconsider her entire life. What if she stopped measuring herself by sun garden standards? What if she found shade garden ways to thrive? She had deep empathy, probably developed through her own suffering. She had patience, learned through chronic illness. She had creativity in making do with little, born from poverty. These weren't consolation prizes for failing at normal success. These were actual strengths, shade plant qualities that were valuable in themselves. She started making different choices. She took a job that paid less, but required less energy, allowing her to work sustainably rather than constantly burning out. She developed friendships with others who lived in shade, creating community with people who understood difficult circumstances. She stopped apologizing for needing things that others didn't need, recognizing that shade plants legitimately need different care than sun plants. Word spread about Yuki's garden and the perspective it represented. People who felt they were growing in difficult conditions began to see themselves differently. A man with learning disabilities stopped trying to compete in academic environments and found work that used his practical intelligence. A woman with anxiety stopped forcing herself into high-stress social situations and built a life that honored her need for quiet. A family with limited income stopped feeling inadequate for not achieving wealth and found richness in their strong relationships. The shade garden teaching, as people began to call it, spread beyond individuals to organizations. A school started creating shade garden programs for students who couldn't thrive in standard classroom environments. A business developed positions specifically designed for people with limitations that made traditional jobs difficult. A community center created spaces for people who needed accommodations that mainstream spaces didn't provide. Not everyone appreciated this perspective. Some critics said it encouraged people to accept limitations rather than overcoming them. "You're telling people to give up," they argued, "to accept that they can't thrive in normal conditions rather than working to change their circumstances." Yuki would answer these critics by walking them through her garden. Look at these plants. Should they be working to become sun plants? Should they be trying to overcome their shade-thriving nature? Or should they be celebrated for being excellent at what they actually are? She would point to a struggling plant that needed more light. Sometimes you do need to change conditions. This plant is genuinely in the wrong place. It needs to be moved to a more light-filled place. But most of these plants, they're exactly where they should be, thriving in conditions that sun plants would call impossible. The question isn't whether to overcome all limitations. The question is whether your limitations are like shade for a shade plant, the right conditions for your actual nature, or like shade for a sun plant, wrong conditions that need to change. A teacher named Nobuo applied this to his classroom. He stopped trying to make all students thrive in the same way. He recognized that some students were sun plants who needed bright, fast-paced, competitive environments. Others were shade plants that needed quiet, slow, supportive conditions. Trying to make shade plant students compete in sun plant ways was as futile as trying to grow ferns in full sun. He created different pathways through his curriculum, different ways to demonstrate learning, and different environments within his classroom. And he found that students he had previously considered struggling were actually thriving. They just needed shade garden conditions to show what they could do. Years later, Yuki's garden became something of a pilgrimage site for people living in difficult circumstances. They would come to see that lushness was possible even in shade, that beauty didn't require ideal conditions, that thriving could look different from what sunny gardens showed. Yuki, now elderly, would sit in her garden talking with visitors. "The hardest thing," she would tell them, "is stopping comparing yourself to sun gardens. Stop measuring your lushness by their standards. Stop trying to be bright when your beauty is subtle. Once you accept that you're a shade garden, once you stop apologizing for it and start working with it, you discover possibilities you never knew existed. She would touch the ferns and hostas she had planted decades earlier, now mature and magnificent. These plants are barely surviving in bad conditions. They're thriving in ideal conditions for their nature. The shade isn't their obstacle, it's their element. And the same might be true for you. Tonight, as you rest, you might reconsider the shade you're growing in. The difficult conditions you've been taught to see as obstacles might actually be the right environment for who you actually are. Not who you think you should be, not who sun gardens demand, but who you actually are. Stop trying to grow sun plants in shade. Stop measuring yourself by standards designed for different conditions. Start asking, what does thriving look like for a shade plant? What can I grow that loves these exact conditions? What beauty can emerge specifically because of these limitations, not despite them? Rest now in your shade garden. Let yourself be a fern, a hosta, a delicate shade flower. Stop burning yourself trying to bloom in full sun. Sink into the cool moisture of your actual conditions and discover what wants to grow there. Shade isn't a deficiency. It's just a different light. And different light creates different beauty. Trust that yours is worth growing. The path of Zen unfolds like morning mist, soft and patient. In this next tale, we are invited to see, beyond appearance, into essence. Listen carefully to the next story. In a village known throughout the region for its ceramics, there lived a potter named Fumiko, who had inherited her father's workshop and his reputation for perfection. Her father had been famous for creating bowls so symmetrical, so flawless, that wealthy merchants would travel for days to purchase them. Every curve was exact. Every glaze was even. Every piece was a testament to complete control over the materials and process. Fumiko had learned her father's techniques perfectly. She could throw a bowl on the wheel with such precision that it seemed made by compass and ruler rather than human hands. She could apply glazes so evenly that no variation of color disturbed the surface. Her work was impeccable, and her success reflected that. Orders came from nobles and temples. Her workshop prospered. But Fumiko herself was miserable. Each piece she created felt lifeless to her, though she couldn't explain why. They were beautiful, yes, perfect, certainly. But holding one of her bowls felt like holding a cold stone. There was no warmth in them, no personality, no soul. They were technically masterful, but somehow empty. She tried to push these feelings away. After all, people praised her work constantly. They paid premium prices. They displayed her bowls in places of honor. Who was she to feel dissatisfied when she had achieved everything her father had taught her to achieve? One autumn, a traveling monk stopped at Fumiko's workshop. He was old, his robes worn but clean, his face weathered by years of walking mountain paths. He asked if he might trade a blessing for a simple bowl to carry his daily rice. Fumiko, who gave generously to monks, brought out one of her perfect bowls. "Please, take this, it's my gift." The monk held it, turning it slowly in his hands. His face was unreadable. "Is something wrong?" Fumiko asked. "It's very beautiful," the monk said carefully. "Very perfect." But where is the potter in this bowl?" I see perfection, but I don't see you. Fumiko felt something crack open inside her chest. This stranger had spoken aloud the very thing she had been feeling but couldn't name. I don't understand, she said. Though she did. She absolutely did. The monk set down the perfect bowl and pulled from his bag an old tea bowl he carried. It was rough, clearly handmade, with an uneven rim and a glaze that had run in unexpected ways during firing. There was a spot where the potter's thumb had pressed into the soft clay, leaving a permanent impression. The bowl was crooked, sitting unevenly when placed on the table. This bowl, the monk said, was made by a potter who had nothing to prove. Look here. He pointed to the thumbprint. I can see the exact moment when the clay was soft and the potter was human, and the two touched. This bowl tells me a story. It speaks of someone who was fully present while making it, not worried about perfection, just engaged with clay and water and fire. He lifted it to his lips, pretending to drink. When I use this bowl, I'm touching that potter's humanity. The imperfection is not a flaw. It's a signature. It's proof that a real person, with real hands, in a real moment, made this thing. He looked at Fumiko's perfect bowl again. Your bowl could have been made by a machine. It reveals nothing of you. It hides you behind perfect technique. It's beautiful, but it's also lonely. The monk thanked Fumiko for her generosity and continued on his way, taking her perfect bowl with him. But his words stayed in her workshop like smoke, impossible to ignore. That evening, Fumiko sat at her wheel with a fresh ball of clay. She began to throw a bowl, but this time she did something different. When her hand slipped slightly, creating a small wobble in the rim, she didn't smooth it away. She left it. When a bit of glaze dripped unevenly during application, she let it drip. When her thumb pressed too hard in one spot, leaving an impression, she allowed it to remain. Every instinct she had, every lesson from her father, screamed at her to fix these flaws. But she resisted. She let the bowl be what it wanted to be, imperfect and honest and human. When it came out of the kiln, Fumiko held it with trembling hands. It was crooked. One side was slightly higher than the other. The glaze was uneven, darker in some places, lighter in others. There was a clear thumbprint in the clay and a small crack that had formed during firing but hadn't broken all the way through. By every standard she had been taught, this bowl was a failure. But as she held it, turning it slowly in the light, she felt something she had never felt holding her perfect bowls. She felt moved. This bowl had a presence. It spoke of the afternoon she had made it, the way the light had come through the window, the mood she had been in, the questions turning in her mind. It was unique in all the world. Every other bowl she had ever made could be reproduced, but this one, with its specific flaws and accidents and human touches, could never be made again. She set it on her shelf, not for sale, just to look at. The next day, a customer came to the workshop, a tea master from the capital who had purchased Fumiko's bowls for years. "Show me your new work," he said. Fumiko brought out her usual pieces, perfect and symmetrical. But the tea master's eyes drifted past them to the crooked bowl on the shelf. "That one," he said. "May I see that one?" "Oh, that's not for sale," Fumiko said quickly. "It's flawed. I was just experimenting. Please, the tea master insisted. Reluctantly, Fumiko brought down the crooked bowl. The tea master held it, and his face transformed. He turned it slowly, examining every imperfection with what looked like delight. "This," he said softly, "is the first piece of yours that has made me feel something. Your other bowls are impressive. They showcase your skill. But this bowl has wabi-sabi." Wabi-sabi? Fumiko had heard the term, but never fully understood it. "The beauty of imperfection," the tea master explained. "The aesthetic of the impermanent, the incomplete, the imperfect. In tea ceremony, we value this quality above all others. A perfect bowl is cold. It intimidates. It makes you afraid to use it, afraid to break it. But a bowl like this..." He cradled the crooked bowl gently. "This invites you to hold it, to use it, to accept its nature and your own nature as equally flawed and equally beautiful." He looked at Fumiko seriously. "I will pay you 10 times your usual price for this bowl, and I hope you will make more like it." Fumiko found herself saying no. She couldn't explain why, but she wasn't ready to sell that bowl. It had taught her something she was still learning. Over the following months, Fumiko began to experiment with allowing imperfection. Not sloppiness, she still worked with care and skill, but she stopped trying to control every variable. She let the clay speak. She let the fire decide some things. She let her own humanity show in the work. Some pieces came out more crooked than others. Some were more symmetrical. No two were alike. And all of them had something her perfect bowls had never had. They had soul. They had presence. They revealed the person who made them. Her old customers were confused at first. Some stopped coming, wanting only the perfection they had come to expect. But new customers arrived, people who understood wabi-sabi, who valued authenticity over perfection, who wanted to hold a bowl that felt alive rather than ideal. One day, years later, a young potter came to Fumiko's workshop seeking to apprentice. The young woman looked around at the various bowls and asked the question Fumiko had once silently asked herself. "Which of these is your best work?" Fumiko picked up a bowl that leaned noticeably to one side, its glaze running in unexpected rivulets, a clear fingerprint visible in the clay. "This one," she said, "not because it's most technically accomplished, but because it's most true. See this wobble? I made this bowl on a day when I was sad about something I can no longer remember. My hands were unsteady, and the clay recorded that unsteadiness. This isn't a flaw. It's a diary entry in clay. It's proof that I was alive, was feeling something, was human when I made it." She set the bowl down gently. "For years, I made perfect bowls that could have been made by anyone with sufficient skill. But these imperfect bowls? These could only have been made by me, on these specific days, in these specific moments. The crooked bowls are my truest work because they hide nothing. They reveal everything, my moods, my doubts, my humanity, and in doing so, they give others permission to accept their own imperfection too." The young potter picked up the crooked bowl, feeling its uneven weight, seeing her own reflection distorted in its irregular glaze. "So, you're saying," she began slowly, "that the goal isn't perfection?" "The goal is presence," Fumiko replied. "When you're trying to be perfect, you're not really there. You're thinking about what you should be doing, what the result should look like, whether you're succeeding or failing. But when you let go of perfection and just engage fully with the material, with the process, with the moment, that's when you make something real. That's when your work becomes art instead of just craft. She smiled, remembering her father's perfect bowls, understanding now why she had needed to move beyond them. Perfection is impressive, but imperfection is honest. And in the end, honesty is more beautiful than perfection could ever be. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider your own crooked bowls, the parts of yourself you've been trying to perfect, to fix, to hide. What if those imperfections aren't flaws to be corrected, but signatures to be accepted? What if the wobble in your voice, the unevenness of your journey, the visible marks of your struggles are not evidence of failure, but proof of authentic living? You are not a machine-made bowl, smooth and perfect and identical to 1,000 others. You are handmade, unique, bearing the clear imprint of everything you've experienced. Your imperfections tell your story. They make you irreplaceable. Rest now in your own crooked beauty. Let yourself be imperfect, incomplete, impermanent. Let yourself be human. This is not a flaw in your design. This is the design itself, and it's more beautiful than perfection could ever be. In the hush of understanding, Zen offers us another glimpse of what it means to recognize worth not by weight or shine, but by presence. Here starts the next story. In a province divided by a deep gorge, there lived a master bridge builder named Kazuo. He had constructed bridges across rivers, over valleys, spanning impossible distances. His bridges were renowned for their strength and elegance. People traveled safely across waters and heights that would otherwise have been impassable. All thanks to Kazuo's skill and courage. But Kazuo harbored a secret that no one suspected. He was terrified of heights. This fear had been with him since childhood, since the day he had climbed too high in a tree and fallen, breaking his arm. The memory of that fall, the stomach-dropping sensation of nothing beneath him, had never left. Yet somehow, he had become a bridge builder, perhaps because he wanted to conquer this fear, or perhaps because he wanted to create safe passage for others over the very thing that terrified him. For years, Kazuo managed his fear through careful strategy. He would design the bridges in his workshop, calculate every measurement, supervise construction from solid ground. His apprentices would do the high work, walking the beams, securing the cables, testing the spans. Kazuo would stay below, calling instructions, his feet planted firmly on earth. His bridges were masterpieces of engineering. Each one stood as testament to his brilliant mind. But Kazuo knew the truth. He had never once walked across one of his own bridges. He had never felt the sway of the structure he designed. He had never looked down from the height his calculations assured was safe. This secret gnawed at him. He felt like a fraud. How could he call himself a master bridge builder if he was too afraid to cross his own creations? One spring, the provincial governor commissioned Kazuo to build his most ambitious bridge yet. A span across the deepest part of the gorge, connecting two mountain villages that had been isolated from each other for generations. The bridge would need to be long, high, and strong enough to withstand the winds that howled through the gorge. Kazuo accepted the commission. He drew the plans, made the calculations, selected the materials. Construction began, and as always, his apprentices did the high work while Kazuo supervised from below. The bridge took 2 years to complete. When it was finished, it was magnificent. A graceful arc of wood and rope and stone spanning the gorge like a prayer made solid. People came from distant villages just to see it. The day before the official opening ceremony, Kazuo stood at one end of the bridge, looking across to the other side. The governor had requested that Kazuo himself cut the ceremonial ribbon at the center of the span to honor his achievement. This would require Kazuo to walk halfway across his own bridge, in front of hundreds of witnesses. Kazuo felt his heart hammering in his chest. He looked down into the gorge, a distance that made his vision swim. He couldn't do it. He simply couldn't. That night, Kazuo didn't sleep. He lay in his bed, shame and fear warring inside him. By morning, he had decided he would tell the governor he was ill. He would send an apprentice to cut the ribbon. He would find some way to avoid the truth. But before dawn, there was a knock at his door. It was Yuki, his senior apprentice, a young woman who had worked with him for 5 years. "Master," she said, "I know your secret." Kazuo's face went pale. "What secret?" "Your fear of heights. I've known for years. We all have." Kazuo sat down heavily. "Then you know I'm a fraud." "No," Yuki said firmly. "I know you're human, but I also know something else. May I show you?" She led Kazuo to the bridge in the pre-dawn darkness. They stood at its entrance, looking across the span that was barely visible in the dim light. "Master," Yuki said, "may I tell you what I've learned working with you?" Every bridge begins as fear. Fear of the gap, fear of the height, fear of the distance. That's why bridges exist, to address fear. You think your fear disqualifies you from building bridges, but actually your fear is what makes you the best bridge builder I've ever known. "How can that be?" Kazuo asked. "I'm too afraid to even walk across them." "Exactly," Yuki replied. "Someone without fear might build a careless bridge. They might miscalculate, might miss a danger because they don't feel in their bones how high the stakes are. But you check every measurement 3 times. You select materials with obsessive care. You design with such caution, such attention to every possible failure point, because you understand fear. Your bridges are so safe precisely because you're so afraid." She stepped onto the bridge, her feet confident on the boards. "Come. Just one step." Kazuo took one step onto the bridge. His legs trembled. "The fear you're feeling," Yuki said. "Where is it? Is it in the bridge?" Kazuo looked down at the solid boards beneath his feet. "No, the bridge is fine." "Is it in the gorge? Is the gorge reaching up to hurt you?" "No." "So where is the fear?" Kazuo touched his chest. "It's in me. It's in my mind." "Yes," Yuki said gently. "The danger you fear exists only in your imagination. The bridge is real. The gorge is real. But the catastrophe you're imagining, the falling, the failing, the shame, that's not real. That's a story your mind is telling about what might happen, not what is happening." She took another step. "Come, one more step. Don't think about the whole bridge. Just this one step." Kazuo took another step, then another. He kept his eyes on Yuki, on the boards directly beneath him, not looking down into the gorge, not thinking about the distance to the other side. The fear says you'll fall, Yuki continued, walking slowly backward, leading him forward. But have you fallen? The fear says you can't do this, but are you doing it? Step by step, they moved across the bridge. Kazuo's breathing was ragged, his hands shaking, but he didn't stop. He focused only on the present step, the present board, the present moment. The obstacle, Yuki said, was never the height. It was never the gorge. It was the story in your mind about what the height and the gorge meant. The bridge you needed to cross wasn't this one. It was the gap between your fear and your action. They reached the center of the bridge. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten. Yuki stopped. "This is where you'll stand today," she said. "Where you'll cut the ribbon. Where you'll acknowledge your achievement. Can you do it?" Kazuo looked around, truly seeing for the first time where he stood. He was at the center of his own creation, high above the gorge, and he was not falling. The bridge held him. The structure he had designed was keeping him safe, just as he had calculated it would. "I built this," he said, wonder in his voice. "I built something strong enough to hold me, even though I was afraid." "You built more than a bridge," Yuki replied. "You built proof that fear doesn't have to stop creation. That courage isn't the absence of fear, but action in the presence of fear. Every bridge you've ever built was an act of courage, Master. You just couldn't see it because you were looking at your fear instead of your actions." They walked back across the bridge together as the sun rose. This time, Kazuo looked down into the gorge, really looked. It was deep, yes. The height was real, yes. But the bridge was also real. His knowledge was real. His years of careful calculation were real. The fear was just one truth among many, not the only truth. That afternoon, when the ceremony began, Kazuo walked across his bridge in front of hundreds of people. His hands still shook slightly. His heart still beat fast. The fear didn't disappear. But he walked anyway, and when he reached the center and cut the ceremonial ribbon, he felt something he had never felt before. Not the absence of fear, but freedom in spite of it. In the years that followed, Kazuo still felt fear when he crossed bridges, even his own. But he crossed them anyway. He learned that courage wasn't about being unafraid. It was about recognizing fear as a feeling, not a fact, as a story the mind tells, not a truth that must be obeyed. He would tell his students, "The obstacles that stop us are rarely as solid as they seem. Most of them are built not of stone and distance, but of belief and imagination. We think we can't, and so we don't try. We imagine failure so vividly that we mistake the imagination for reality. But if you take one step, then another, focusing only on what's real in this moment, rather than what's imagined about the future, you often find that the obstacle dissolves. It was never as solid as you believed." Tonight, as you rest, you might consider the bridges you haven't crossed because of fear. What obstacles exist primarily in your imagination? What catastrophes are you so certain will happen that you never test whether they're true? What would one step look like? Just one step, not the whole journey, just the present moment's possible action. Your mind will tell you stories about falling, failing, being hurt or humiliated. These stories feel so real that you mistake them for prophecy, but they're just stories. The present moment is offering you solid boards beneath your feet. a structure that can hold you, a possibility you've been afraid to test. The bridge is stronger than your fear of it, and you are stronger than the stories your mind tells about what you cannot do. Rest now in this truth. Let your fears be what they are, feelings, not facts. And know that tomorrow, if you choose, you can take one step onto a bridge you've been afraid to cross. Just one step. That's all courage ever requires. As the lantern of awareness glows a little brighter, we come to a tale about seeing with more than the eyes. Let the stillness guide you now, and listen carefully to the next story.